Chapter 2245. When Meng Hu landed in the Daxing sect, he found that there were no restrictions blocking him. He didn't find it strange and flew straight to the Taoist temple at the highest point of the valley. These sects that submitted to the spirit of creation method had received Yifang's message not long ago and knew that they had been exposed. However, they weren't prepared to resist as the latter hoped. Although each sect had changed their cultivation method, it didn't mean that they had lost their rationality. They were very clear about what they were facing. The Yen sect had branches in all the worlds, so it was obvious how powerful they were. There were at least 2 mortal metamorphosis level almighties in the Kunshu continent. Even if the Yen sect wasn't mentioned, those big sects wouldn't let them off easily in order to prevent their branches on the Kunshu continent from being affected by this method. Therefore, going against them openly was a dead end. Only by compromising would they have a way out. The Daxing sect had such thoughts at the moment. After seeing Meng Hu's arrival, the higher-ups of the Daxing sect directly opened the sect's formation. Then, the sect master came out with a few elders and solemnly saluted, "Is this Taoist friend from the Yen sect?" Meng Hu didn't say a word. With a thought, he directly dragged everyone's mind into the mind realm. Everyone in the Daxing sect fell into a daze and fell into a coma. This was a method that Meng Hu learned from his doppelganger. It seemed to be very useful for those who had obtained the spirit of creation method. Moreover, it looked simple and crude, and didn't require much thought. As for whether it was inappropriate to do so, Duan Qing had said that no matter what they did, someone else would take care of the rest. However, it had to be said that this method was the most suitable for the current situation. Because his method was different from Yao Canbei's, it had inadvertently played a role in distinguishing. Anyone that was deeply rooted in the Tao art of the spirit of creation would fall into self-obsession because of the conflict between the 2 Tao arts, and it was impossible for them to wake up in a short period of time. Perhaps they would continue to be lost like Yifang. On the contrary, those who didn't have a firm Taoist heart would easily accept the other method. However, this was just jumping from one cliff to another, because to the outside world, every cultivator who knew about this Tao art could spread it. Only when they completely forgot about this Tao art could people be at ease. Duan Qing saw that Meng Hu did not move for a long time after he entered the Daxingmen's mountain gate. There were no signs of fighting either. At first, he felt it was strange. Then, he received a spiritual message saying that the matter had been resolved. He was extremely astonished. His original plan was that once Meng Hu could not come to an agreement with this person, then he would immediately make a move and destroy this place. This result was obviously out of his expectations. He descended from the spirit boat and personally examined it. He discovered that it was just as Meng Hu had described, and this result made him pleasantly surprised. If he could resolve it with a gentle method, it would be better than a massacre. With a turn of his consciousness, his dharmic powers shrouded the entire Great Conduit sect. For the cultivators who were not deeply involved in the creation spirit Tao technique, he conveniently erased a portion of their memories. For those who were deeply involved in the Tao and could not be pulled back, he used a talisman to suppress their dharmic powers. He planned to drag them back and deal with them later. In order to prevent the news of this place from being exposed, he ordered the remaining cultivators to seal the mountain gate and not to communicate with the outside world before the matter was resolved. After dealing with these matters, he came to Meng Hu's side and patted him on the shoulder. He was very pleased and said, "Well done. Let's do it this way." He felt that Meng Hu was very good. He was not as useless as those disciples had said. He was straightforward and dared to fight. He was very compatible with him. In the past, those were just the jealousy and prejudice of mediocre people. The 2 of them returned to the spirit boat and headed to the next sect. When they arrived, just like in the Great Conduit sect, Meng Hu first pulled people into the state of mind. Then, Duan Qing erased their memories and suppressed those who were too obsessed. Soon, the problem was solved. In less than a day, more than 10 sects had been taken down by them. The remaining sects were also observing their actions. However, when they saw that Duanqing did not have any violent conflicts with any of the sects after his arrival, and did not stay in each sect for long, it gave them a huge misconception that Duanqing was only here to warn them. In this case, there was no need for them to openly confront him. Therefore, wherever the two of them went, the higher-ups of the sects would come out to greet them politely. This made it easier for them to solve the problem. In just a few days, they had achieved their original goal. On the way back, Duanqing also felt a little incredulous. Previously, he had thought that arguing would not solve the problem. In the end, it was inevitable that he would use a ruthless method to deter them. However, he did not expect things to go so smoothly. Now, even if Elder Yuan questioned him on why he had acted on his own without informing him, he could refute him confidently. The biggest contributor here was undoubtedly Meng Hu. He shook his head and sighed. Elder Yuan doesn't know how to use people. He thought about He Feng and Meng Hu. The former had always been showing off in front of others, hoping that everyone in the sect would know that he was the next great protector. But in reality, he was secretly colluding with the spirit of creation. Relying on the heretics was secondary. Perhaps he was thinking about how to subvert and disintegrate the Yen sect after he became the next great protector. Such a person was actually favored and promoted by Elder Yuan. It was simply ridiculous. As for Meng Hu, usually, he silently contributed to the Yen sect. He never made it public and never complained. He even bore many misunderstandings from his fellow sect members. Not only that, when the spirit of creation landed here, he had already trapped him in a trap. If it were not for him meddling, he would have been finished off long ago. Now, he had easily solved a big problem. The difference between the two could be said to be obvious at a glance. He glanced at Meng Hu, who was playing with the civet cat. He secretly made up his mind that no matter what, he would recommend him to be the next great protector. Although he did not have the power of recommendation like Elder Yuan, as the great protector of the branch altar, his opinion would definitely be valued by the main altar. At this moment, Meng Hu's clone had already returned with the unconscious He Feng. Moreover, he excitedly came before Elder Yuan to claim credit for his achievement. He said in an extremely complacent manner, "Elder, He Feng has been captured and brought back." After seeing He Feng, Elder Yuan was also stunned. Although he had entrusted this matter to Meng Hu's clone, he had already prepared himself for failure. But now that Meng Hu's clone had really captured him, he still felt that it was a little unreal. After a careful inspection, he found that it was indeed He Feng himself and not a substitute created by some divine ability. He also heaved a sigh of relief. Now that he had captured this person alive, he would be able to answer to the headquarters, and he would be absolved of a lot of his crimes. However, this matter had been resolved. Now that Duanqing was going to those sects, a violent conflict was inevitable. If the impact spread, perhaps those sects that usually had conflicts with the Yanjiao would also intervene. In the end, he would probably have to clean up the mess. When he thought of this, he could not relax again. At this moment, he suddenly felt a clamor outside. His heart tightened and immediately teleported to the outside of the branch altar. He saw Duanqing returning with Meng Hu. Afraid that the two of them had caused big trouble, he hurriedly walked forward and said in a low voice, "Protector Duan, you're back? How did it go?" Duanqing replied, "Elder Yuan, Protector Meng and I have already cleaned up all the sects that were affiliated with the spirit of creation Dao technique. Those cultivators who were bewitched by the spirit of creation Dao technique have all had their memories erased. The remaining stubborn people have all been brought back. They will not cause any more trouble." Elder Yuan was a little stunned. It was resolved. With Duanqing's mana, it was indeed not difficult to resolve this matter if he used forceful methods. However, only a few days had passed. He asked in surprise, "How did Protector Duan do it?" Duanqing stretched out his hand and pointed at Meng Hu. He said loudly, "Elder Yuan, Protector Meng has contributed the most in resolving this crisis. He can take on a great responsibility. I believe that he can be the next great protector." Meng Hu sighed and said, "The position of great protector is not what I wanted. I am satisfied to be able to resolve a crisis for the branch altar." Elder Yuan was expressionless and pretended not to hear anything. If Meng Hu's contribution was real, then he was indeed very suitable to be the next great protector. However, this matter could not be decided by him. Otherwise, he would still have to bear the responsibility if there were any problems in the future. Now, he might as well hand over the position of the branch altar master. As for how the headquarters would arrange it, it was none of his business. Hence, he coughed and did not express his opinion. Duanqing saw him like this and thought that he did not agree. He scoffed and said, "If you don't agree, then I will bring up this matter to the headquarters." At this moment, a deep voice was heard. "Protector Duan, what do you want to say? You can say it to me." The two of them looked and saw that a plain-looking middle-aged cultivator in a gray sackcloth robe had walked over. Elder Yuan was shocked. He said, "Elder Gao." He hurriedly bowed. "When did Elder Gao arrive? I was unable to welcome you. Please forgive me." Gao Gua said, "It's all right. I came here on the sect master's secret order. I did not want to make it public." Elder Yuan glanced at Zhang Chan, who was standing beside Gao Gua, and greeted him. He then said, "It's not convenient to talk here. Why don't the two of you follow me to the inner hall?" Gao Gua nodded and followed him into the inner hall. When everyone was seated, he learned about what had happened from Duanqing. He then said to Zhang Chan, "So it's your disciple who made a contribution." Zhang Chan glanced over and saw that Meng Hu was looking straight ahead and sitting there obediently. He chuckled and said, "At least he has some ability. He did not embarrass me." Gao Guo pondered for a while and said, "Protector Meng has made two great contributions. I will report to the sect master when I return. However, this matter is not over yet." His expression turned serious. Although Protector Duan brought back those stubborn cultivators, there are still many who have comprehended such Dao techniques that have escaped. These sects clearly knew that cultivating Dao techniques of the spirit of creation was a great taboo for all sections. How could they not have prepared a backup plan? They must have sent some disciples who were not on the name list out. This was a great trouble in the future. At this moment, Zhang Chan said, "Leave this matter to me. Meng Hu is my disciple. As his master, I will be the one to fix the loophole in what he did." Chapter 2246. Zhang Chan was only a high official in name, but Gao Qingtu and Gao Guo knew that his identity was related to the sect ancestor, so when Gao Guo saw that he took the initiative to accept the task, he immediately said, "Then I'll leave this matter to you, high official Zhang." Zhang Chan said, "It's a piece of cake." Gao Guo looked at Elder Yuan and said, "Elder Yuan, the sect leader has decreed that you are still in charge of guarding this place. After 100 years, you can return to the main altar." Elder Yuan quietly agreed. Gao Guo only said this and did not give any other instructions, not even a word of comfort. This was enough to show that the sect leader was very dissatisfied with him, and it was likely that he would not be able to stand in front of the public after he returned. But at this time, he could not help but say, "Elder Gao, regardless of whether the sect leader believes it or not, there is no selfishness in my decision." Gao Guo said in a low voice, "The sect leader said that you indeed have no selfishness, and the overall situation is considered stable, but most of the decisions are based on your own preferences. You have great merits, but also great mistakes, and your merits and demerits cannot offset each other." Elder Yuan smiled bitterly and did not dare to say anything more. Gao Guo came down and started making arrangements. When he came here, he thought that the situation would be very difficult. Perhaps the branch altar would encounter an unprecedented change. But now, everything was calm. The branch altar had eliminated the disaster with its own strength. This could be considered as making up for the fault of the branch altar's higher-ups. But in his heart, he also knew that all of this had nothing to do with Elder Yuan. In terms of merits, Duanqing and Meng Hu were naturally the biggest, and Meng Hu was the most outstanding, as the two biggest problems were almost solved by him. Originally, with Meng Hu's current merits and Duan Cheng's recommendation, it was more than enough for him to be promoted to the chief protector, but the whole thing was caused by the Tao of the spirit of creation, so he still had doubts about Meng Hu's identity as the spirit of creation. He did not dare to make a decision on this matter, and decided to report it to Gao Qingtu first before making a decision. But he still gave Meng Hu extra praise. Because of Zhang Chan's presence, Meng Hu seemed to be extremely modest and indifferent, causing everyone present to repeatedly glance at him. They felt as if he'd become a completely different person, and it was even to the extent that they suspected that he'd been possessed during the process of stabilizing the Tao art of the spirit of creation. Duan Qing nodded his head repeatedly. Sure enough, it was all the prejudice of the people in the past. Guardian Meng was not the kind of person these people described him to be. Zhang Chan did not say a word about the discussions and decisions in the branch altar. After the meeting was over and everyone left, he called Meng Hu over and asked him a few questions before letting him go. He watched as Meng Hu walked to the side to argue with his doppelganger about who had contributed more. He snorted and strode out of the branch altar. When he arrived at a high slope, he spread out his sleeves, and countless golden bugs swarmed out, searching everywhere for the surviving members of the various sects who were in hiding. Even though these people hid very well, their realms were not high after all. Very soon, he discovered their tracks, and found them one by one. Then, he erased their memories regarding the Tao art of the spirit of creation. If these people did not have a mortal metamorphosis cultivator to help them cover their traces of the past, and did it very covertly, as well as specially letting a few cultivators who did not cultivate the Tao art of the spirit of creation to look after them, Duan Cheng would have discovered their tracks when he was inspecting the various sections. Just as he was about to stop, he suddenly felt that something was wrong. After another round of inspection, he discovered that there was still one person that he had missed. This person was very powerful. Because his level was extremely close to his, he had almost hidden from his senses. However, he did not search purely for the person's past. At the same time, he used the golden bugs to repeatedly search for similar chi dynamics, and only then did he discover the other's tracks. That person obviously also realized that he had been discovered, but he did not retreat, and instead released his divine will. Zhang Chan immediately stepped into the unknown, and saw that the person opposite him was a Taoist dressed in a scarlet robe. His face was unfamiliar, and he had never seen him before. The Taoist bowed to him, and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoist." "I am Feng Mo." Zhang Chan also bowed, and said, "Fellow Taoist, do you know what you're doing?" Feng Mo smiled, and said, "Of course I know, this is only a Tao art. If a Taoist cultivator's mind is firm, then he can naturally subdue it, and there is no need to regard it as a tribulation poison." Zhang Chan conversed with him for a while, and just now, he understood that this person did not directly receive the Tao art from Yao Kenbei, but after observing the Tao art of the spirit of creation in the various sects, he comprehended the method to use it on his own. However, he felt that something was wrong. Yao Zanbei's Tao art was relatively closed, because he did not want others to discover his identity, so how did this person know? Could it be a coincidence? Looking at the person's appearance, he did not believe it. Feng Mo did not hide this, and said calmly, "A few hundred years ago, I obtained a memory, and at a certain time, I came here, and I could obtain a superior Tao art. I followed this, and indeed, I gained something." When Zhang Chan heard this, he could not help but think of those people who were blessed by the heavens, and knew the past and future for no reason. However, as the sect strictly investigated, and with the return of the Tao art, these people gradually disappeared. He did not expect to meet another one here, and this person might be hiding something, so he said, "Are you willing to swear that you will not teach this Tao art to others?" Feng Mo smiled, and did not say anything, and his consciousness disappeared. Zhang Chan snorted coldly. If that was the case, then he could only think of a way to catch this person. He felt that his master might have sent him here for this person. In the land of creation, because many sects that worshipped the Tao art of the spirit of creation were eliminated, the ripples caused by this Tao art quickly weakened to an extremely low level, and the four Vedanta also noticed the changes here. Xiang Ju smiled and said, "It seems that Taoist Xianyuan found out about this, and took action to clean up. Forget it, there is no need to mention this again." Heng Wu, on the other hand, frowned. To them, the rise and fall of the present world, and the birth and death of all living things, were all fleeting, and they seemed to have paid a little more attention to the present world recently. They naturally understood the reason, and to be more subtle and to transform was the way to complete the Tao art, but he still felt that something was wrong. After pondering for a while, he did not speak to Wei Ming and Xiang Ju, but directly found Ji Zhuang, and told him his thoughts. Ji Zhuang said in a low voice, "Not only you, I also felt it. Perhaps when we were attracting the spirit of creation to the Weili, we were also affected by this power." Heng Wu thought about it and felt that it was possible. Originally, the spirit of creation stood on the opposite side of them, and there were Vedanta almighty beings who devoured them. Now that they were continuously receiving these Weili, they would definitely be affected. However, the problem was not that serious, because if these Weili could do anything to them, then there was no need for them to send down the Weili incarnation, they could directly destroy them. Moreover, Hongdu was now focused on getting rid of the spirit of creation Weili. If he felt that something was wrong, he would not turn a blind eye to it, and would definitely stop it. The two of them spoke a little more, and thought that this matter would not affect them too much for the time being, so they did not continue the discussion. However, the two of them vaguely felt that they seemed to have overlooked something, but they could not seem to recall what it was at the moment. In Cheong Shao Tian, Danny sat upright and still. He did not know how long ago, but he had discovered that traces of power were spreading from the void, and they were constantly interfering with him. This was, in fact, the spirit of creation's Weili. As a part of the spirit of creation, it was naturally easy for him to come into contact with this part of power. In reality, due to their own level, all the spirits of creation did not have the ability to absorb the Weili, and these were purely attracted by their Tao. However, because Dan Yi acknowledged the human Tao from the bottom of his heart, he didn't deviate from his original path. It was just that he had to endure all kinds of chaotic thoughts at all times. It wasn't too bad in the past few decades, but the current situation was becoming more and more intense, making it difficult for him to calm his mind and comprehend the Tao. He had thought of many ways, and even separated a part of his power, but there was no way to solve this problem, and at most, he could only slightly slow it down. After thinking for a long time, he finally made a decision, and with a turn of his consciousness, he transferred into his own heart realm. Not everyone had the ability of the spirit of creation's reincarnation, but he had it, but he had never used it before. After achieving true yang, he had never come here again. There was a person who looked exactly like him sitting there. This was the manifestation of the Tao technique of the spirit of creation. However, he had long suppressed this Tao technique with his own Tao intent, so the two of them could be said to be standing in the same formation. However, as he looked over, strands of black aura seeped in from the outside, entering the person's body, but the Tao incarnation had a calm expression, and said, "If you do not think of a way to expel this power, then I may deviate from your wishes." Danny sighed, "I have already tried, but I can't do it for now. I wonder if you have any other way, fellow?" The Tao incarnation said unhurriedly, "If you want to solve it, you can only use my Tao to absorb and dissolve it, but if that happens, my Tao will definitely surpass yours, and if you can't suppress it, I'm afraid I will return to my original state." Dan Yi agreed. "What fellow Taoist says is correct. This isn't appropriate. That energy is endless, and if I try to block it, it won't be much of a problem. But if fellow Taoist absorbs it, it will only temporarily resolve my problems. In the future, there will be no end to my troubles and I might not even be able to suppress you." The Tao incarnation said, "Fellow, you are right to be cautious, but even if I don't take the initiative to absorb it, this power will still invade. Although it can't affect your mind now, if it continues, it is still not appropriate." Danny thought for a moment, and nodded. If this situation only continued for a few dozen years, it would be fine, he could still ensure that he would be fine, but if it continued for hundreds or thousands of years, it was hard to say what would happen to him, and he was most afraid of some kind of subtle influence that even he wouldn't be able to notice, and by then, it would be too late to return to the right path. He pondered for a moment, and said, I can't solve this problem, but there is someone who can. I will go and ask for advice. He left the heart realm and went to Xianyuan heaven. When he arrived at the gate of Qinghuan Palace, the formation spirit seemed to know that he was coming, and was already waiting there to welcome him into the hall. Dan Yi saw Zhang Yan sitting on the jade platform, 5 lights rotating behind him, and Xian Qi surging under his body. He didn't dare to look too long, and came up to Greetings, Grand Supreme. Zhang Yan looked down and said with a smile, Fellow, are you here because of a problem in your heart? Dan Yi said, Yes, I came here today to ask Grand Supreme for advice on the way to solve it. Zhang Yan smiled slightly, and said, Fellow, you don't have to worry about it. In I's opinion, this is your fate. If you can grasp it, you may be able to transcend in the future. Chapter 2247. Fated Chance. Dan Yi was startled and couldn't help but look at Zhang Yan. Could it be that the so-called transcendence was referring to the upper realm? Zhang Yan nodded. The mighty power of the spirit of creation itself came from an extremely high level of power. Dan Yi was only attracted to it because of his background. Actually, he didn't need to resist it blindly. As long as he was strong enough and his fate wasn't too bad, then he could use this opportunity to climb to the higher realms. Even though it was dangerous, for cultivators who pursued the great Tao, they were not afraid of the danger, but the fact that there was no path up there. Therefore, this was a fated chance that ordinary cultivators could not even dream of. Dan Yi thought about it and understood what it meant. He said, I'm just afraid that I'll take the wrong path and get lost and lose control of myself. What he was worried about was that his cultivation base was not obtained from the spirit of creation Tao technique, but his own cultivation base. The original Tao technique was originally subservient to him. Now that he obtained power again, it was very likely that the primary and secondary would be reversed and he would no longer be himself. Zhang Yan smiled and said, Fellow Taoist, the Tao technique in your heart has long been subdued by you. Even if the scattered power comes over, it will not affect you for now. However, you can use it to see the upper realm and understand the mysteries. Dan Yi's Tao technique and the spirit of creation Tao technique seemed to be irreconcilable, but in reality, he did not need to resist it blindly. He could guide it and use it as a reference. If he could really enter the next realm, then as long as he did not take the initiative to guide it, the influence would not be a big deal. Dan Yi lowered his head and fell into deep thought. He thought of many things. First, different realms required different situations. When he was in the pure Yang realm, he had to face connate demons, extraterrestrial demons, and even heartless Tao. Although he did not know what the upper realm was like, he could tell from the bits and pieces that Zhang Yan occasionally revealed that even at that realm, cultivators did not really transcend and would still face all kinds of enemies. It might even be more dangerous. If he wanted to walk down this path, it would be one thing if he didn't succeed. However, if he did succeed, he would definitely have to face these things. The path of cultivation was about continuously moving forward. If one were to shrink back and deny oneself, then this path would naturally not be able to be taken. Therefore, he had to sort out his own heart as to what he should do. He raised his head and asked, May I ask, Supreme One, if I don't walk this path, are there any other paths that I can take? Zhang Yan said, In the next 10 years or so, the troubles that fellow Taoist has encountered will be slightly alleviated, but this matter may not necessarily be over. In the future, fellow Taoist may feel more weily. Before the true body of the spirit of creation descended, his weily would continue to arrive. In fact, most of the power here had been worn away by his weily, and only the tiniest part of it had descended. But as long as the fragment of the spirit of creation still existed, it was impossible for him to completely destroy it. However, for great virtue, the weily of the spirit of creation had almost no effect on him now that it had been weakened to this extent. Dan Yi still couldn't make a decision at this moment. Moreover, if he really had the opportunity to cross to the upper realm, it was not certain that he would succeed. He still needed to think carefully, so he said, "Thank you for dispelling my doubts, Supreme One." He cupped his hands and bowed, then excused himself. Zhang Yan knew that he still had doubts in his heart, but this could only be resolved by himself. He had only pointed out a feasible path. With Dan Yi's foundation, there was still a certain possibility that he could embark on the path of spiritual refinement. Moreover, his body was a fragment of the spirit of creation. Once he stepped into this realm, he could even dilute some of the power of the spirit of creation. Even though it was an extremely weak part, even a little bit was still a weakening. What Xiang Ju and the others failed to do, Dan Yi might be able to accomplish. However, he raised his head and looked at the crack in the void. Now, there was an unprecedented amount of the spirit of creation Weili that had seeped in. This also meant that with the summoning of Xiang Ju and the others, the next incarnation of the spirit of creation would soon arrive. On the Kunshi continent, Zhang Chan had been searching for Feng Mo's whereabouts. However, the golden bug, which was usually successful in every endeavor, had not been able to find him at all. Moreover, he had missed by just a little bit each time. He had a strange feeling that Feng Mo seemed to be very familiar with him and had prepared a method to guard against him in advance. Therefore, he thought of a possibility. Perhaps Feng Mo had once fought with him in the future that he had glimpsed, so he was able to avoid his methods. It was just that Feng Mo's cultivation was not as brilliant as his. Otherwise, there was no need for him to hide everywhere. Logically speaking, it should be impossible for Feng Mo to see anything related to his past and future. Therefore, what Feng Mo saw was either an illusion deliberately created by someone, or there was a higher power behind him pushing him. In the end, an illusion was an illusion and could not fall into reality. Therefore, it was very likely that the upper magic power had interfered. Regarding this, he was not surprised. He knew that other than Rendao's Yuanzun, there were also heavenly demons, innate demons, and even the heartless Dao. These powerful beings had been trying to infiltrate Busu heaven. If it was their doing, then Feng Mo's performance was not strange at all. Facing an opponent that was familiar with you, but you did not know what methods they had. This was the most troublesome thing. He was not afraid of not being able to deal with them. He was only afraid that they would not stay in the Kunshi continent and instead escape to another world. This meant that they had a safe place to escape in the future that they saw. At this moment, Feng Mo was hiding everywhere. As if he had foresight, he would always leave before Zhang Chan arrived. In fact, it was as Zhang Chan had guessed. Among the many futures that he saw, there were far more than what he had said. There were even scenes of him fighting with Zhang Chan. Therefore, he was now carefully moving according to the future that he saw. Just like how he calmly told Zhang Chan that he had the ability to foresee, it was because he had done such a thing in the scene that he saw. If he did not say it, he was very afraid that the subsequent events would not develop as he saw. It was like he was walking on a chess game that had been arranged in advance. He cautiously protected all the futures that he saw. He did not dare to take a wrong step, for fear that there would be more changes in the future. Losing the opportunity was a small matter, but his life was the most important. He had also thought of not doing this, but completely by himself. However, he did not dare to do so because if he escaped beyond the sky, then as long as he was not in the void primordial sea, it would be easy for Yan Jiao to find his whereabouts. And if he followed the steps, he would still have the chance to escape after a dozen years. At that time, he could leave this place and concentrate on cultivation. After learning the Tao of the spirit of creation, he already had unlimited possibilities. Even if he went to a world with ordinary spirit, he could still cultivate to the perfect realm. After that, he could find a way to fight for the primordial jade. In the future that he saw, there was no chance in the Kunshi continent because it had long been targeted by the powerhouses of various sections. He could only find a way to go to the mysterious mirror branch of Yan Jiao. It was very likely that there would be a mysterious stone born there. If he could become the fated person, then he would have the chance to be ranked among the creator Yuanzun. At the headquarters of Yan Jiao, Gao Qingtu was looking at the report that Gao Gua had handed over. He was also very surprised. That matter that he thought was rather troublesome was easily settled. After reading the details, he found that the greatest contribution here was made by Meng Hu. He secretly nodded. Although he was the spirit of creation, he was indeed a talent. If such a person was not the great protector, who could be? Not to mention that he was a disciple of Zhang Chan. He might even be a chess piece buried by the sect ancestor. Thinking of this, he naturally had a lot less apprehension. He immediately drafted a decree and didn't delay for a moment. He ordered someone to send it to the Kunshu continent. Gao Guo quickly took back the letter and immediately passed down the decree. Although Meng Hu didn't really become the great protector, in fact, after He Fang was captured, the great contribution he made was known to everyone in the branch altar. So, he had long been treated as the great protector. With the decree this time, it could be considered justifiable. Duan Cheng called Meng Hu over and said earnestly, "Guardian Meng, no one in the branch altars can compare to your contribution, but your cultivation base is slightly lacking. If you can increase it a little, it will be perfectly justifiable," but his expression became a bit more serious. "You must not be impatient for success and walk the wrong path." Meng Hu listened for a while, but still stood there without moving. Seeing that he didn't respond, Duan Cheng asked curiously, "Protector Meng, did you hear that?" Meng Hu said embarrassedly, "Protector Duan, I'm just a doppelganger. You want me to improve my cultivation, but I can't do it." Duan Cheng was stunned. He took a closer look and found that it was true, but just now, he couldn't tell. He was also a little embarrassed. He coughed and said, "Then where is your real body? Why don't you take back your doppelganger?" Meng Hu's doppelganger was very unconvinced. He straightened his neck and said, "So what if I'm a doppelganger? My doppelganger also made a contribution." Duan Cheng didn't want to argue with a doppelganger. He thought that since he had already told the doppelganger, Meng Hu would know and understand what he meant. Duan Cheng shook his head in his heart. A doppelganger was ultimately not as good as the real body. Meng Hu was sincere and humble, why would he talk about the contribution? Somewhere in the land of creation, as the number of creation spirits Weili increased, Hongdu suddenly stood up from the high platform. He looked in a certain direction and said with burning eyes, "They're coming." He could feel that there was a force gathering behind the robbery power. From this moment on, the doppelganger of the Weili could fall into the land of creation at any time. At this moment, Xiang Ju and the others no longer had the relaxed expressions from before. Instead, their expressions turned serious. This time, it would not be like last time where they only saw a Dharma body crumble. Instead, they would really have to fight the spirit of creation. In the Qinghuan Palace, Zhang Yan also looked at the crack in the void. This person had come slightly earlier than expected. On one hand, it was because the Weili had already arrived, and on the other hand, the robbery power had dissipated more than expected. If Xiang Ju and the others hadn't taken the initiative to guide it, there would have been great virtue Weili descending. However, because it was completely repelled by the creation spirit's Weili, their opportunity to return was completely taken away. However, if they could get rid of this Weili this time, it wouldn't be a big deal. Chapter 2248. Zhang Chan stood on a rock at a lower elevation and continuously sensed the scenery transmitted back by the golden bug. He had chased after Feng Imo for more than 100 days. In order to avoid a certain future, he had tried to act randomly and not act according to the plan. However, Feng Mo's ability was not small and had almost predicted every step he took. In this way, even if his Fa Li surpassed Feng Imo, he could not do anything because he could not find Feng Imo at all. He thought about it and decided to think of another way. Would it be possible to find helpers to chase with him? This seemed to have a greater chance, but since Feng Imo could predict him, then even if he found helpers, Feng Imo would still be able to avoid him unless there was an additional variable to break this stalemate. He felt that if he pulled his disciple, Meng Hu, over to search, it might be possible to achieve this. Meng Hu was a spirit of creation. His cultivation in Tao was not high, but his foundation was extremely high. Feng Imo could see some of the future, but he might not be able to predict everything. He thought about it and felt that it was worth a try. Thinking about this, he could not help but chuckle. He did not think that he, as his master, would have to rely on this brat for help. He immediately drafted a letter and sent it back, asking Meng Hu to try to enter the realm of mortal metamorphosis in a short amount of time and come find him after he succeeded. He was not afraid that Feng Mo would leave at a time like this, because Feng Mo was definitely waiting for something. Even if he really left and was not on the Kunshe continent, the impact he could cause would be much smaller. Comparatively speaking, it would be much easier to deal with him. Meng Hu quickly received the letter. Previously, he had already let go of his Fa Li cultivation after receiving Zhang Chan's care and Duan Cheng's persuasion. Now that he received the letter, he did not dare to disobey his master's orders. It was rare that he did not spend half a day fishing and half a day drying the net, but instead cultivated in seclusion. In reality, he had already accumulated enough, but in order to polish his state of mind, he had been suppressing it. If it was Yao Canbei with his state of mind, he would have long since reached the perfection of mortal metamorphosis. After half a year of seclusion, he successfully entered the realm of mortal metamorphosis. He was originally prepared to leave and rush over to help, but Zhang Chan did not rush him over and let him settle for a few more days. When Meng Hu heard this, he went into closed-door training for another half a year. When he felt that his cultivation had stabilized, he rushed over to meet up with Zhang Chan. When Zhang Chan saw him, he checked his cultivation and found that his state of mind and cultivation had passed. He was satisfied and said, "This time, you will stay by my side. You don't have to do anything. I have other things to take care of after that." Meng Hu agreed obediently. For the next 10 days, Zhang Chan brought Meng Hu along and continued to use the same method to chase after Feng Mo. However, the situation did not seem to be much different from before. Feng Mo still managed to avoid them time and time again. However, Zhang Chan became excited because he noticed that he'd almost found traces of this person a few times during this pursuit. This undoubtedly showed that the method he'd chosen was effective. With the addition of Meng Hu, there was indeed an additional variable that made it impossible for him to predict all the future changes. There was naturally a reason why he had not grasped it yet. However, he already had an idea in his heart. He called Meng Hu over and instructed, "Come down, the two of us, master and disciple, will go our separate ways. This time, master will allow you to do as you please. You don't have to pay attention to me." Meng Hu said in a loud voice, "Disciple will do as master says." During these past few days of following by Zhang Chan's side, he'd abided by the rules and didn't dare take a single wrong step. Now that Zhang Chan had agreed to let him go out and do things by himself, it caused his mood to rise. How could Zhang Chan not see through his thoughts? He chuckled and flicked his sleeve as he said, "Go." Half a day later, a brilliant light flashed by, and Feng Mo appeared within the cavern. Although he'd once again successfully avoided Zhang Chan's pursuit, his expression was heavy, and he wasn't as relaxed as before. Just as Zhang Chan had expected, he'd indeed seen Meng Hu in the future. However, the latter's future wasn't clear, and it was blurry. Although he'd been prepared for this since long ago, when Meng Hu truly appeared before him, he still felt that there were slight variables. A few days ago, Meng Hu and Zhang Chan had separated. Although this was a future that he'd seen, this was actually the most fragmented part of the future, and there were many things that he couldn't see clearly. This caused him to have no choice but to be extra cautious. Although he hadn't made any mistakes up until now, this was only the past. If he were to make a wrong step and cause the future he'd chosen to go wrong, then all his previous efforts would become meaningless. Fortunately, he felt that he still had a method here. Because a person's style and actions were usually traceable, he could always rely on his opponent's previous actions to judge the next one. He felt that Meng Hu was surely extraordinary. However, he'd always been following Zhang Chan's actions earlier, yet he didn't go overboard in any way. With a single glance, he was able to discern that Meng Hu was an extremely well-behaved person. It was very rare for such a person to make any shocking actions, but he couldn't eliminate the possibility that Meng Hu would win by a surprise move under Zhang Chan's care. So, He still couldn't let his guard down. He sat down cross-legged. After a short moment, those seemingly familiar scenes once again appeared before his eyes. In reality, even he himself didn't know that the scenes he saw every single time changed along with the events of the world. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to achieve this. However, after Meng Hu joined in, these futures became chaotic, and this was also the reason why he'd almost made a few mistakes in succession. After a short while, he opened his eyes, and his gaze was slightly bright. After a long consideration, he suddenly thought that since these futures looked blurry, then wouldn't it mean that some changes in the details wouldn't shake the entire situation? Since that was the case, he could take the initiative, and he didn't need to be as sluggish and rigid as before to describe the future's actions. For example, if he could kill Meng Hu ahead of time, would he be able to kill those additional variables and get things back on track? With this thought, he believed that he'd found a way to deal with it. He chuckled, stood up, and looked outside. All he needed to do was wait for an opportunity to make a move. Within the void, just as all the Vedanta were paying attention to the creation spirit's wailing, the power at the crack in the void had been spiraling and brewing, and it had yet to descend. Some of the Vedanta wailing mixed in with the robbery power were repelled by the tyrannical and condensed Vedanta wailing, while the weak and scattered Vedanta wailing were drowned and devoured. Although the creation spirit hadn't completely broken through the barrier and didn't have its own consciousness, as the power that had seeped into the all-beings increased, it sensed their threat, so it didn't descend in one go. Instead, it was doing its best to strengthen itself. The burning light in Fengdu's eyes grew brighter. In his view, although it was gathering power, it was just a struggle. Because it wasn't descending fully, no matter how much power it accumulated, there was a limit. He alone was enough to suppress it. As for Xiang Ju and the others, he thought that they were only there to attract the wailing. It didn't matter if they participated in the battle or not, as long as they didn't drag him down. Xiang Ju and the others were also watching. They had stopped receiving the wailing, because there was no need to do so now, and they would descend on their own. Fengdu analyzed and said in a low voice, "The wailing that descended this time is probably stronger than we expected." Heng Wu said, "I'm afraid it's not just that. The wailing from before will definitely be used by them." Xiang Ju said, "With fellow Fengdu here, it shouldn't be difficult to subdue them." It wasn't that the four hadn't considered the possibility of failure. As this thought crossed their minds, they couldn't help but look at where Bushutian was. If they couldn't resist it, this person would definitely make a move. After waiting for a long time, Xiang Ju and the others suddenly felt their hearts palpitate, and their auras suddenly became extremely oppressive. At the same time, everything in the world began to sway. Everything in the world was swaying back and forth between existence and non-existence. Only Bushutian didn't move at all. Upon seeing such a scene, Ji Zhuang and Heng Wu did not wait for Hong Do to take care of them, both of them took out the precious lotus of good fortune in their hands, preparing to receive the tribulation power that was about to pour out in torrents, so that they would not suffer any damage. However, before they could do so, the aura actually gradually converged and then vanished into nothingness. The expressions of Xiang Ju and the others darkened. They could all see that it wasn't that the creation spirit Weili's incarnation was no longer descending, but that it had completely restrained its power, dissolving the tribulation power on its own before it reached the world. They didn't understand why the spirit of creation would do such a thing, but the latter didn't have the lotus of good fortune in hand. If he could easily accomplish such a feat before falling into the hands of all beings, then he was definitely much more powerful than they had expected. At this time, the wailing that hadn't descended for a long time finally broke through the tribulation power's obstruction, tore through the void, and fell into the world. Seeing this, Taoist Fengdu snorted, waved his sleeve, and walked out of the land of creation. Xiang Ju and the others looked at each other. First, they worked together to send out a wailing, firmly suppressing the purple-robed Taoist, and then they followed him out. A moment later, a Taoist emerged from the void. His face seemed to be shrouded in a layer of flowing light. Just by appearing there, the wailing of the great virtue and ordinary spirit refinement cultivators were continuously swallowed by him. From this alone, it could be seen that he was born to oppose the great virtue, and it was impossible for them to stand on the same side. At this moment, Xiang Ju and the others all had the thought of destroying him as soon as possible. This came from the urging of their own Tao, because if they didn't do so, they might be the ones who would be eliminated. At this moment, the Taoist seemed to look at them, and layers of flowing light suddenly bloomed behind him. At the same time, the creation spirit Weili that was previously scattered in the world also gathered on his body, and his aura was actually rising. Seeing this, the expressions of the four changed. Seeing that Hongdu still hadn't made a move, Xiang Ju couldn't help but send a voice transmission, "Fellow Taoist, should we stop him?" Hongdu said resolutely, "No. If he wants to take the Weili, then let him take it. The more, the better. It's best if he can take all of them, and then we can catch them all in one go." These powers were immersed in the fragments of the creation spirit, and it was very troublesome to find them, and it was also very difficult to eradicate them. He didn't have the leisure to pay attention to these trivial matters, but now that the creation spirit had taken the initiative to gather, it was exactly what he wanted. Chapter 2249. After the Taoists' qi activity continued to rise, it finally stopped at a certain height. At that moment, everyone realized that their senses seemed to have been contaminated, but after the Weili was removed, it became much clearer. However, they all knew that the Weili did not disappear, but instead gathered on the incarnation of the creation spirit Weili. When Hongdu saw that the gathering of the Weili was over, the light in his eyes became sharp. He did not make any unnecessary movements, but immediately held a spell and chanted Tao sounds. In an instant, wherever his Weili went, the sound of Xian music was vibrated, and endless Tao techniques were evolved. As soon as the voice rang out, the Taoist's figure instantly became blurry. He had already fallen into the all-existence, but now, he seemed to be separated from it. Moreover, the mighty power that he had devoured was also severed. Taoist Feng Du's Tao technique was very mysterious. As long as he finished reciting this long chant and did not stop, he would be able to drive his opponent into eternal silence. Even if the opponent was a spirit of creation, it would not be an exception. Although the creation spirit's original body would not die because of this, when the original body truly descended, it would be impossible to get back the power that was lost. The Taoist realized his situation, and the brilliant treasure light behind him propped up. His body became much more stable, and the originally clear Tao sound also became much more chaotic and blurry. Then, he reached out and grabbed at Hongdu. A sneer appeared on Feng Du's face as he continued to chant. His body took a step back, but there was still another version of himself standing there. When the treasure light arrived, it immediately passed through the figure in front of him, and the two of them disappeared together. Xiang Ju and the others did not have perfect bodies. In their memories, they only knew that Hongdu was better than them, but they were not very clear about what methods he had. However, at that moment, when they saw the scene, it was not difficult to see that he could not stop before the Tao sound finished chanting, so they all made a move and pressed their Weili. However, when they collided with the Taoist's Weili, they were swallowed up. Heng Wu said, "This person can devour our magic power." Xiang Ju narrowed his eyes and said, "Don't worry, he can devour our Weili. As long as he doesn't take away my Tao technique, he can't dissolve our Weili. With fellow Fengdu supporting us, let's see how much he can devour." Wei Ming nodded. Although the creation spirit's Weili was powerful, it could not suppress everyone. The act of devouring the Weili looked terrifying, but it was nothing more than that. As long as they were alive, they could give as much as he needed. Besides, they were not here to defeat him. They only wanted to hold him back from the side. When Fengdu's chanting ended, everything would be settled. The Taoist seemed to feel threatened and suddenly turned his face. Although his face did not reveal any facial features, only a layer of flowing light, Xiang Ju and the others could feel that this person was staring at them. Then, the Taoist, Feng, and Taoist. Heng Wu and Ji Zhuang sensed that something was wrong, so they immediately stood up and supported their creation spirit, Pauline. Then, their expressions changed slightly. They felt that the Pauline in their hands was slightly heavier. It was clearly because they were supporting the Weili, but where did the Weili come from? They did not notice any signs beforehand. Wei Ming and Xiang Ju, who did not have the Pauline in their hands, frowned. They found that their bodies were actually turning into nothingness. Although the process looked extremely slow, the power that corroded their bodies appeared out of nowhere, and they were unable to guard against it. Xiang Ju was calm at this moment. He said, "Fellow Taoists, there is no need to be anxious. Let him do what he wants. The more he invests the Weili on us, the smoother it will be for fellow Fengdu. Moreover, if there is really danger, how can fellow Fengdu ignore it?" In a cave somewhere in the Kunshe continent, after Feng Imo sorted out his thoughts, he was ready to take the initiative to attack. He felt that although Zhang Quan and Meng Hu acted separately, Meng Hu was a person who abided by the rules. Therefore, even if he had a strange move arranged by his master in advance, he would definitely be lacking in decision-making and various adaptations. This was his chance. The other party would never have thought that a person who was being chased by them would suddenly turn around and attack. Through those vague futures, he determined a few possible locations for Meng Hu and secretly set up a formation. As soon as Meng Hu appeared, he would immediately rush over and kill him. He did not wait for long before the chi activity he had set up responded. However, this time, there were movements in two territories at the same time. He originally thought that he had accidentally discovered the tracks of Zhang Quan and Meng Hu. If that was the case, he could only give up on his plan. Forget about Meng Hu, Zhang Quan was very good at searching for traces. Once he came into contact with Meng Hu's chi activity, he would know the location of his opponent, but Meng Hu could also use this clue to find him. Putting aside the fact that he was not Meng Hu's opponent, to ensure that the general situation would not change in the future, he had to avoid meeting Meng Hu as much as possible. However, when he looked down, he realized that the situation was different from what he had imagined. The chi activity that had been triggered actually came from two Meng Hu. He did not have to think to know that one of these two was definitely a clone. However, after he observed for a while, he was shocked to find that no matter how he tried to distinguish, he could not tell which was the clone and which was the real one. Originally, waiting for Meng Hu to come to him so quickly was in line with his expectations, but this scene made him hesitate. Should he directly choose to attack one of them, or ignore it and continue to wait for a better opportunity to attack? If he chose to attack, once he made a wrong judgment, he would expose his goal. He might not be able to find such an opportunity again. He pondered for a while and felt that if Meng Hu continued to use the clone as a cover, could it be that he would not attack? Therefore, he decided to take the risk. With a thought, he teleported to the location where the chi activity was hidden. After a moment's examination, he headed in the direction of Meng Hu's location. However, at this moment, he didn't notice that as he gradually approached Meng Hu, the scenes of the future he saw were gradually disappearing, and a strand of vital energy was ceaselessly being drawn out from his body at a place he couldn't notice. The mountain and sea realm's western wilderness, Heaven's Shocking Mountain, was the headquarters of the Shaoqing sect. Hong Yu was a guest there. When he had first arrived, he had said that he had come to discuss the sword. He had never imagined that he would be treated with extraordinary courtesy. This surprised him a bit. In his early years as a cultivator of the Primal Yang sect, he had had dealings with Shaoqing cultivators. However, he had never been treated with such courtesy. Later, he learned that after the mountain and sea realms Dao discussions, it was usually the Shaoqing disciples who went to visit other sections. Very few cultivators from the 9 continents would visit just to ask for advice. At this moment, he was discussing the Dharma with Ran Shushu. Discussing the Dharma with a Shaoqing disciple was actually a discussion of the sword. However, when mortal cultivators fought to the death, there was no need for them to personally go into battle. All they had to do was to use their divine wills to simulate the battle. That way, not only would their relationship not be harmed, but they would also be able to compare who was superior. As the two of them were practicing their respective techniques, Hong Yu was distracted for a moment, and his sword slowed down slightly. Just now, he sensed a familiar power appear. Ran Xiushu couldn't help but find it strange that he was distracted. Considering Hong Yu's cultivation base, unless something unexpected happened, something like this would never happen. She asked, "What's wrong, fellow Taoist?" Hong Yu shook his head. "It's nothing." Ran Xiushu saw that he didn't want to talk about it, so she didn't pursue the matter. Instead, she said in a slightly regretful tone, "Fellow Taoist's sword technique is very brilliant. However, in my opinion, there are some areas where it is a bit conservative. If it were fully unleashed, its power would be even greater." He admired Hong Yu very much. This person was able to break free from the old and bring forth the new. He fused the yin and yang swords and pushed his sword technique to an unprecedented height. It was extremely rare and precious. However, this flaw made him feel slightly regretful, because the Hong Yu he was facing right now was not at his peak. Hong Yu fell silent for a while before saying, "That's because I encountered an opponent who defeated me without even using a single move. He only demonstrated his divine will. I've been thinking about how to deal with this setback. As a result, I lost the harmony in my sword technique." Ran Xiushu's interest was piqued when she heard that. She said, "There's actually such a person. May I know who he is? And what method did he use?" Hong Yu did not mention Xin Chang's name. He only roughly described the method that he used to achieve harmony. Ran Xiushu's eyes lit up when she heard that. She rubbed her hands and said, "May I know where he is now?" Hong Yu shook his head. "I don't know either. However, I think that with his cultivation base, there's probably only a few people in the same generation as him apart from the people in your sect." "That's not necessarily the case." Ran Xiushu pointed upwards and said, "Do you know of that person in Xianyuan heaven?" Hong Yu's expression turned serious. "I've heard of him. His battle prowess in the past is also admirable. However, he has already reached the upper realm of cultivation. I can't even see his elegant demeanor even if I wanted to." Ran Xiushu said with a provocative smile, "You're mistaken, fellow Taoist. There's still a chance." Hong Yu glanced at him and asked, "What do you mean?" Ran Xiushu said, "The Origin Mirage Gate has a sect treasure called the Heart Image Spirit Return Great Spiritual Tablet. I believe fellow Taoist knows about it." Hong Yu pondered for a while and nodded. "Are you saying that I can borrow this treasure to see that person's past? However, that person has already transcended beyond the world. This treasure might not be able to reflect his original form." Ran Xiushu sighed and waved his hand. "There's no need for the original form. Fellow Taoist only needs to find the memories of that person." In reality, after Zhang Yan had severed the past and future, the Great Spiritual Tablet would no longer have any qi activity left on it. Moreover, he had already achieved great virtue. However, he still had disciples in the present world, so he allowed the cultivators of the 4 tribes and even Bu Su Heaven to retain their memories of him. Therefore, Hong Yu only needed to visit those who knew Zhang Yan one by one and collect their memories before putting them into the Great Spiritual Tablet. Then, he would be able to summon an incarnation that was pieced together from their memories and have a battle with that person. Hong Yu quickly understood the crux of this matter. Being able to discuss the Tao with a brilliant person was his wish, not to mention that this person wasn't simple at all. It was rare for him to be excited. He solemnly cupped his hands and said, "Thank you for your reminder, fellow Taoist. If I can really discuss the Tao with that person, it would be my fortune." Chapter 2250. Feng Mo was unable to discern whether Meng Hu was real or fake, so he could only rely on his own judgment to choose one of the 2 territories. But his luck seemed to be bad, as the person he chose just happened to not be Meng Hu's real body, but his clone. However, even when he got closer, he could not tell. After sensing Zhang Chan's qi dynamic, in order to not be discovered by Zhang Chan at the same time, he threw out a ray of spiritual light from a great distance away. At this moment, Meng Hu's clone also discovered that Feng Mo was approaching, and he said excitedly, "It's time for me to make a contribution." He ignored the arrayed disc as if it was nothing, and with a thought, he dragged Feng Mo's mind into his state of mind. In a trance, Feng Mo felt that he had fallen into a strange world. Then, he heard someone preaching a Tao technique there. After listening carefully, he suddenly realized that it was actually a spirit of creation Tao technique, and it was quite different from the one he had observed. After a slight comparison, he couldn't help but be entranced. He walked towards the source of the voice and saw a Taoist sitting in the middle of the boundless clouds. When he saw the face, he was shocked and said, "Meng Hu." Due to Meng Hu's insistence on his own cultivation, he had been suppressing that Taoist technique. As a result, the Taoist in his heart realm had already transformed into his appearance. When the Taoist saw him, he immediately stopped his lecture and sighed. Fellow Taoist's cultivation method has deviated from the right path. Feng Mo was anxious and bewildered in his heart. He guessed that this ought to be some sort of illusory realm, but the spirit of creation Tao art wasn't fake. At this moment, when he heard Feng Mo speak, he couldn't help but ask, "What's wrong?" The Taoist didn't speak much, and he directly displayed the profound principles of the Tao art. Of course, this Tao art was one where the user was the master, and it didn't blindly follow the Tao art itself. The method that Feng Mo learned was secretly obtained from observing others and had not been truly imparted by the spirit of creation. Now that he heard the truth, he listened as if he was intoxicated. Sometimes, he sighed, sometimes, he muttered to himself, "So that's how it is, so that's how it is. It turns out that I've gone the wrong way." He felt that this technique was extremely in line with his heart, and he firmly believed that this was the true great Tao. For a time, he couldn't bear to leave this place, and he continuously chased and asked questions, gradually becoming engrossed in it. In reality, he had also fallen into obsession. It was obsession towards the grand Tao. If he couldn't solve the confusion in his heart or wake up, then he wouldn't leave this place. When Meng Hu's avatar saw this, he immediately transmitted a message to Zhang Chan. Zhang Chan quickly arrived and looked at Feng Mo, who was standing blankly in midair. He glanced at the avatar and said, "You captured him." Meng Hu's clone said proudly, "Teacher, I've said it before, Meng Hu can't compare to me." Zhang Chan couldn't be bothered to listen to him anymore. With a slap of his palm, he dispersed Feng Mo. Then, he stretched out his hand and pointed. A talisman flew out and suppressed all of Feng Mo's mana. Feng Mo's chi dynamic was in a mess, and only then did he wake up. When he saw Zhang Chan, he immediately understood the situation he was in. He begged, "Zhang Shangzhen, since I've already been captured by you, can you let me go back and listen to the Tao technique?" Zhang Chan sneered and said, "Do you know that you foolishly cultivated the spirit Tao technique of creation, and you're the enemy of all Taos? Now that your life is in danger, you still have the mood to listen to this?" Feng Mo said, "As the saying goes, if one hears the Tao in the morning, one can die in the evening." Zhang Chan interrupted him and said, "There's no need to talk about this. I can tell you that you still have a way to live." Feng Mo's spirit rose slightly. If he could live, he naturally wouldn't want to die. So, he said, "Zhang Shangzhen, please give me some pointers." Zhang Chan said, "As long as you swear that you won't spread this Tao technique in the future without my permission, and you won't submit to the Tao technique, I can spare your life." To deal with those who refuse to come to their senses, his methods would naturally be stricter, but it wouldn't be to the extent of killing them all. Even the Taoist cultivators who were captured previously, once they woke up, as long as they swore not to spread the Tao and not to submit, then he could let them go. As for those who had entered the Tao too deeply, they would forcefully cut off their memories. If they couldn't do it, then their mana would be sealed and they would be imprisoned. Feng Mo hurriedly said, "After I heard the Tao, I already know what to do, and I'm willing to follow Shangzhen's words." After saying this, he swore on the spot. At this moment, Zhang Chan asked, "What exactly did you see in those scenes from the future? Why did you stay here for so long and not leave?" Feng Mo searched his memories and revealed a bewildered expression. Zhang Chan saw that something was wrong and asked, "What's going on?" Feng Mo said, "Most of the shadows of the future that I saw have dissipated, but I still remember that there seems to be an opportunity at the mysterious mirror division, and I need to wait for a certain time." When the time comes, I'll be able to grasp it. Zhang Chan pondered for a moment, and this problem was very likely related to Meng Hu. He secretly noted down the matter of the opportunity, and said, "Previously, you were able to escape my pursuit, but because of the arrival of my disciple, you revealed a flaw?" Feng Mo sighed and said, "That's right. After fellow Taoist Meng arrived, the future that I saw became abnormally vague, and I believed that if this continued, sooner or later I would be captured by your master and disciple, so I had no choice but to come up with this idea. If I had known that fellow Taoist Meng could also hear the Tao technique, I wouldn't have done this." Speaking up to this point, he earnestly asked, "Can Shangzhen allow me to meet fellow Taoist Meng? If I can hear the Tao technique face to face, I will have no regrets." Zhang Chan glanced at him and said, "Sure, as long as you don't regret it when the time comes." Mountain and Sea Realm, Mount Shockwave. Hong Yu had been in the Shaoqing sect for a long time, and had indeed paid a visit to some of his peers. Unfortunately, the almighty Shaoqing experts were either in secluded meditation, went to the outer heavens to visit the Tao, or simply stood guard in the half-realm, so he hadn't been able to meet them one by one. Fortunately, even when the Shaoqing cultivators left, they would leave behind a strand of their divine will in the sect. First, it was to guide the younger generation of disciples, and second, it was convenient for them to exchange pointers with fellow Taoists. Therefore, he had tried to ask for advice, and truly felt that he had gained a lot. He still remembered Ran Xiushu's words, and had originally planned to go to Qinsang to pay a visit. After staying for a few months, he said his goodbyes. Although Ran Xiushu had made the suggestion on a whim, he was actually very interested in it, so he decided to send a clone to accompany him to see the final outcome of the battle. Hong Yu didn't mind. He had always heard that the Shaoqing and Qinsang were on good terms, and if Ran Xiushu, a Shaoqing elder, went with him, many things that he couldn't bring up could be done on his behalf. Therefore, after a few days, he went down Jingxiong Mountain with Ran Xiushu's clone. Originally, he was prepared to go straight to Qinsang School, but Ran Xiushu thought of something and suggested, "Why don't you make a trip to Huanjin Temple first, and pay a visit to Huanjin Temple's sect master Zhang?" Back in the 9 continents, Huanjin Temple was one of the great Xianmen sections. However, in Hong Yu's impression, this sect was only good at subduing demons. If it was purely in terms of fighting techniques, it could only be said to be ordinary. He said, "May I know the reason for this?" Ran Xiushu smiled and said, "This sect master Zhang's cultivation is also outstanding. Not to mention that he's not inferior to you and me, his achievements are already far above the founder of the sect. Now, his Tao techniques are also far superior to the predecessors. Moreover, sect master Zhang is quite related to that person, so it's more convenient to go there to pay a visit to collect knowledge." Hong Yu felt that it was reasonable, so he turned to the southeast, and first went to Huanjin Temple, which was also on the same continent. With the help of the shifting formation altar, in less than an hour, they arrived at the Guanyin continent. The Guanyin continent was originally a barren land, and like most of the territories in the Western Absolute Domain, all kinds of ferocious monsters and demons ran amok. After Huanjin Temple occupied this place, they swept away the different species, subdued demons, moved mountains and peaks, and moved the land and sea. Just now, they opened up a pure and holy place, and now there were Taoist cultivators flying in the sky everywhere. Hong Yu himself was also an elder of a great sect, and from this, it was not difficult to see the prosperity of Huanjin Temple. However, he was only focused on Tao, and thought that other than Tao, there was nothing important, so he did not say anything about it. The two came to the front of the mountain gate of Huanjin Temple, reported their names, and were then invited in. Zhang Zhen heard that the Shaoqing cultivator Ran Xiushu and the previous generation elder of Yuan Yang sect came to visit together, and she also gave them face by arranging a banquet. After talking during the banquet, she heard that Hong Yu was actually looking for her brother's memory, and while she was surprised, she also felt that it was interesting. She also heard of Hong Yu's reputation, but that was in the past. Even with Ran Xiushu accompanying her, she would not agree to this matter rashly. Therefore, she discussed Tao with Hong Yu for a while, and realized that he was indeed extraordinary. After thinking for a while, she passed a part of the memory related to her brother to him. Hong Yu said in a deep voice, "Thank you, sect leader Zhang." Zhang Zhen smiled, "You don't have to thank me, but I also have a condition. If there is an outcome, I hope that you can let me know." Hong Yu agreed without hesitation. To be able to see superior Dao techniques and to be able to fight with superior opponents was his wish. As for how others would think of him if he lost, he did not care at all. Now that the purpose of coming to Huanjin Temple had been achieved, he bade farewell with Ran Shoshu. Using the altar, it did not take long for them to arrive above the Dragon Abyss Sea. Seeing that the two exalted ones came to visit, the reception elder immediately reported. Currently, in Qinsang School, sect leader Qin was still in seclusion, and Meng Zhen was stationed in the half-world for a long time. The person in charge of the overall situation was the upper extreme hall's vice hall master, Qian Tian. However, Ran Shoshu and Hong Yu were not the respected elders of any sect, and it was not his turn to show up. Therefore, he entrusted the matter of greeting the two to Elder Sun Jian. When Sun Jian heard that Hong Yu came to visit, he was also very interested. When he was cultivating, Hong Yu had already ascended, but he also heard of this person's reputation, so he came out to greet him personally. The three of them discussed Dao, and each of them gained something. However, what made Hong Yu regretful was that the mighty figures of Qinsang School each had their own duties, and unlike Shaoqing sect, they did not leave their divine wills there for others to challenge. Therefore, he could only choose to visit a few people. Most of them were neither cold nor warm to him, but in terms of etiquette, they all greeted him according to the reverend of a sect. This was actually common sense. After all, sects like Shaoqing sect that only focused on fighting were indeed rare, and he did not have much of a relationship with Qinsang School. Hong Yu stayed in Qinsang School for half a year, and then he found Sun Jian, and told him the other purpose of his visit. Sun Jian was slightly surprised. He did not expect Hong Yu to have such an idea, and at the same time, he felt that it was very interesting, so he smiled and said, "Then, Daoist Hong Yu, why don't you go to the clear nether heavenly lake to have a try? That is the place where the disciples of Xianyuan are, maybe you can gain something there." Chapter 2251. The Zhaoyu Heavenly Lake was above the Dragon Abyss Sea, so the news of Hong Yu's visit had already reached there. Lu Yenny was in seclusion, but she had a doppelganger outside to manage the situation. After hearing about this, she thought for a while and wrote a talisman letter. She ordered the servant beside her, "Send this talisman letter to Guanzhen." After Qi Yuntian took charge of the sect, many things were also handed over to the eldest disciple, Guan Yingyue, to handle, so the latter could actually represent his master in many aspects. When Guan Yingyue received Lu Yenny's letter, he placed great importance on it. Seeing that she was asking if Hong Yu's matter was the intention of the sect, he didn't dare to ignore it. He personally paid a visit and said, "Benevolent Master's intention is that this is a matter of the Zhaoyu sect, so naturally it is up to the Zhaoyu sect to decide. The sect will not interfere." The Xianyuan sect was under the Taishang sect, so as long as they followed the sect rules, the Qinsang School would not specially assign them to do anything. The 5 Shangjin of the Zhaoyu Heavenly Lake would not interfere with the matters of the upper echelons of the Qinsang School. However, they were Qinsang disciples after all. If the Qinsang School was in trouble, they could not just stand by and watch. Lu Yenny nodded slightly and said, "Thank you for informing me in person." Guan Yingyue said, "We are from the same sect, Shangjin Lu, you don't have to be so polite." After Lu Yenny sent Guan Yingyue away, she thought for a while. As the eldest disciple under the Taishang sect, her every move would be deliberately magnified, so it was not suitable for her to do this personally. She needed to find a suitable person, so she ordered the disciple below, "Go and invite second junior brother here." Jiang Zheng had built a flying hut and drifted outside all year round. He was either cultivating or seeking Dao. If he met a fated person, he would often leave a few words of advice. He had the carefree demeanor of an immortal, so he was usually not in the sect. As the Yaoyin sect master, Wei Zihong stayed in the sect all year round and was not here. As for Yuan Jianqing, although he was in the Zhaoyu Heavenly Lake, he had always been not interested in the banquets. As for Hong Yu, He was the former elder of the Yuanyang sect. Not to mention his status, he had already cut off his past and future bodies. Therefore, he should be treated with courtesy. Among all the people here, only Tian Kun was suitable. Tian Kun arrived at the underwater residence. When he saw Lu Yenny, he greeted politely, "Greetings, eldest senior sister." Lu Yenny gestured with her hand and said, "Shitty, you don't have to be so polite. Let's sit and talk." Tian Kun bowed again and sat down at the side. Lu Yenny said, "Today there is a matter that I need Shitty to deal with." Tian Kun said in a deep voice, "Senior Marshal Sister, please speak." Lu Yenny briefly explained Hong Yu's matter and said, "I'm currently in closed-door cultivation, so it's not appropriate for me to handle this matter. Junior brother will handle this matter on my behalf." Tian Kun immediately agreed. About 100 days later, Hong Yu indeed came to visit. Tian Kun came out to greet him, and the two of them chose a good place to meet at the top of the heavenly lake. After the discussion, Hong Yu knew that the purpose of his visit had already spread here, so he didn't hide it and naturally made a request. Tian Kun said in a deep voice, "When Daoist priest came, there was news from the sect that we can pass on a portion of Master's memories to Daoist priest. However, ever since Master conquered the mountains and seas, he rarely made a move, and he never used his divine abilities in front of us. Therefore, Daoist priest's request can't be fulfilled." Hong Yu said, "Then what guidance does Tian Kun really have?" Tian Kun said, "If Daoist priest Hong Yu is interested, why don't you go to the Yuhuan heavens? Master once traveled there for a period of time and sparred with many Daoists. I believe that Daoist priest Hong Yu's wish can be fulfilled there." Hong Yu cupped his hands and said in thanks, "Many thanks for the information, fellow Daoist Tian." After he had escaped from the world prison, he had actually gone to the Yuhuan heavens. It was a vast place with countless great and minor worlds. However, most cultivators couldn't compare to the cultivators of the 9 continents, so in the end, he returned to the mountain and sea realm to cultivate. But now it seemed that he had no choice but to go there again. As for the past whereabouts of this Tao master, it wasn't difficult to find out. He believed that as long as the master of the dark abyss heaven didn't deliberately hide it, he would be able to find some clues. However, he believed that the sects of the mountain and sea realm were stronger than the sects of the outer realms, so he didn't stop his Tao visit. After Tian Kun saw Hong Yu off, a disciple close to him couldn't help but ask, "Shangzhen, will the patriarch blame you for doing this?" Tian Kun shook his head and said, "What kind of power does master have? In this world, from the smallest of specks of dust to the largest of all things, what can hide from him? If he wasn't willing, then Daoist Hong Yu wouldn't have even thought of doing this. Now that he has come to find me, it shows that master doesn't care about this." The disciple nodded and bowed his head. Disciple was rash. Tian Kun said, "It's fine. It's just that this Daoist Hong Yu is really skilled. I heard that he once won first place in the sword duel among the various sections. He really deserves his reputation." He still remembered what Hong Yu had said just now, that he had been defeated in one move during a duel. Thinking of this gave him some inspiration. He pondered for a moment and found that the answer was right in front of him, but he still felt that there was a layer of distance between them. Fortunately, he had a calm temperament. If he couldn't figure it out for the time being, he wouldn't think too much about it. He put the matter aside for the time being and returned to Lu Yenny to report the details. Zhang Chan had captured Feng Mo and brought him back to the subaltar. It could be considered that he had finished dealing with the matters of the Kunshe continent. He didn't want to stay here any longer, so he called Meng Hu over and said, "I have nothing to do here and need to report back to Xianyuan heaven. You stay here and don't cause trouble, lest you embarrass me." Meng Hu complained, "Master, disciple has never embarrassed master." Zhang Chan didn't bother to scold him and said expressionlessly, "Don't release your doppelganger for no reason." Meng Hu didn't care and said, "Yes, disciple obeys." When Duanqing heard the two of them talking, he thought for a moment and came over to persuade, "Master Zhang, Guardian Meng has been very conscientious and diligent, and has repeatedly made great contributions. Master Zhang, don't be too demanding. Zhang Chan snorted and said, "Let's wait and see what happens." He took out a talisman from his sleeve and activated it. His figure was immediately received by a spiritual light. When he opened his eyes again, he was already in front of Qinghuan Palace. There was already a formation spirit waiting here. After exchanging a few words, he was called in. When he entered the hall and saw Zhang Yan, he quickly bowed and said, "Master, I have returned to report back." Zhang Yan already understood what had happened, so there was no need for him to report again. After praising him with words, he gave him a lot of great medicines. After Zhang Chan thanked him, he said, "Master, there is one more thing." Feng Mo said that he saw a great opportunity in the mysterious mirror subaltar in the future. I thought that with his cultivation, there would be very few things that could move him, so I was suspicious. Could it be Zhou Huanyuan Jade? Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Looks like I can entrust you with such matters in the future." Your guess is right. Zhang Chan was overjoyed and said, "Thank you for your praise, Master. I am willing to share Master's worries." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "You can leave first, I will call you if there is anything." "I will take my leave." Zhang Chan bowed and left. After he retreated, Zhang Yan looked at Bushutian. The mighty force of the great virtue that had opened the world imprisoning chaos sky kept retreating after the mighty force of the spirit of creation arrived. It even fell into the bodies of some creatures. This time, Feng Mo's matter was not a simple glimpse of the future. In fact, after the creation spirit Weili's clone fell into the world, it swallowed the ownerless Weili everywhere. The Weili that came from the prison world didn't want to do that, so it hid everywhere. This mighty force had already been deployed in the 9 continents. Although its actions were not like those of the 4 patriarchs, it still followed them closely and even captured all the cultivators that ascended outside of the 4 great sects of the 9 continents. Most importantly, it was connected to Bushutian, so it could be said that its roots were very deep. Because of this, it was not immediately invaded by the mighty force of the spirit of good fortune. This was also the reason why the Weili, which was originally attached to Feng Mo's body, gradually left after getting close to Meng Hu. It was because it had sensed the existence of the creation spirit. Although there were differences between the creation spirit, the Weili didn't have any spirituality, so it naturally couldn't distinguish between them. The various great virtue Weili had different purposes in investing in the present world. Some were still hard to see, some were like Ji Zhuang, Wei Ming, and the others. They wanted to choose someone to step into the spirit refinement realm and replace them to bear the tribulation power. This way, the owner of the Weili would have a high chance of returning to the world. However, these people had to be chosen from the cultivators of the mortal transformation realm. Previously, Shen Chong didn't accept the primordial jade, so he avoided it once. This caused the Weili to deviate from the fixed direction, so they could only choose other suitable people, and Feng Mo should be one of them. The other obstacle here was the return of Zhou Yuan Jade. Without this item, no matter how talented one was, no matter how great one's abilities were, it would be impossible to cross that barrier. However, there were countless appearances, so naturally there were opportunities. For example, there was such an opportunity in the Mirror Lake. Zhang Yan previously returned the 5 people of Dao Yuan Zun and arranged for them to be here. Although there wasn't any heretic Yuan Zun here, there were Luoism, Xingjiao, Dejiao, and other almighty people's Dao preaching sections. Once karma was stirred up, it wouldn't be inferior to the battle between the people of Dao and the heretic in Busu heaven. Therefore, if everything went smoothly without any obstacles, the Mirror Lake would definitely have the Zhou Huanyuan Jade enter the world. There was no one here who could compete with him, so the primordial jade would definitely fall into his hands. As for the person who entrusted it to him, he already had a plan. While he was thinking, he sensed streams of flowing light flashing. He raised his eyes and looked towards the void. It was the Taoist that the creation spirit Weili had transformed into released a ray of treasure light. As soon as the brilliance came out, it resonated with the many appearances. Instantly, countless lights bloomed, and everything that could be sensed was the same. In an instant, all the Vedanta seemed to be surrounded by this light. Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows. It turned out that the creation spirit had such a trick. It could actually merge many appearances with its own Weili temporarily. If Feng Du and the rest could not break through this Dao technique, then it was very likely that all things would collapse. Next, it would depend on how Hong Du and the rest would deal with it. At this stage, he would definitely not allow the creation spirit to have a foothold among all things. If these few people could not solve this matter, he would come down and try to get rid of this person. Chapter 2252. As soon as the Daoist transformed from the creation spirit used this method, Xiang Ju and the others immediately fell into a predicament. The treasure lights that had bloomed together with the countless worlds also contained the mighty power of the spirit of creation. Right now, the Daoist transformed from the spirit of creation was already devouring their mighty power. With the addition of the light shining on them, if they couldn't stop it in time, it would definitely become stronger and stronger until it devoured them. But in reality, the most dangerous thing was not this matter, but Daoist Feng Du's current attitude. Xiang Ju's divine will transmitted, fellow Daoists, you must persuade fellow Daoist Feng Du, you must not let him let the creation spirit overturn everything. Wei Ming replied, fellow Daoist Feng Du won't do that, right? Xiang Ju said, you're wrong. Fellow Daoist Feng Du has always done things according to his heart. It's fine as long as he can achieve his goal. If he feels that destroying everything can weaken the creation spirit's strength, then he will most likely do it. When everyone heard this, their expressions changed slightly. Ji Zhuang saw that Wei Ming and Heng Wu were moved, but he said, fellow Daoists, I don't think we should go persuade him. After stopping them, he said in a low voice, even though fellow Feng Du pulled us here, he didn't treat us as help. He definitely won't pay attention to us. Perhaps the more we try to persuade him, the worse it will become. Wei Ming frowned and said, are we going to watch everything collapse? Ji Zhuang said, that might not be the case. With fellow Daoist Feng Du's personality, how can he retreat in the face of a strong enemy? Besides, I don't think that Bushutian will watch everything collapse, right? You guys are really worrying too much. Feng Du indeed didn't have any thoughts of retreating at this moment, but it wasn't because he wanted to save everything, but because he didn't want to lose to the other party in a contest of Dao techniques. In his opinion, he judged the other party with Dao sounds, and the other party responded with the contract. This was using Dao to fight for Dao. If he didn't fight the enemy head-on and used some tricks, then he would be avoiding the battle. This was something that his heart wouldn't allow. When he thought up to here, he immediately deduced in his heart with the intention of dispelling this Dao technique. However, if he couldn't break it in time and no one could stop him, the final result would be a complete collapse. Apart from Bu Su Tian and the Mirror Lake, which were rich in creation essence, the rest of the realms would be destroyed. The Daoist transformed by the spirit of creation was also trying to decipher Hong Du's Dao voice, but the latter's Dao technique was equally brilliant. Whoever could resolve the other's technique first would have the absolute advantage, especially since both of their techniques would directly determine the outcome of the battle. Thus, if either side lost the opportunity, it could directly cause them to lose the chance to recover from the disadvantage. In Bu Su Tian, Zhang Yan was watching the battle at the moment, and he was also performing a Daoist deduction in his heart. When the two of them fought, they would naturally display their Dao. As a bystander, he stood at a different point of view, so he could clearly see the changes in their Dao. However, he didn't want to just sit back and watch. The spirit of creation was the enemy of all Vedanta, so he naturally had to be prepared if Feng Du and the others couldn't win. The battle between Vedanta was a battle of their own Dao techniques. Normally, if one had the advantage in strength, one could naturally fight against many. This was because when one used a technique, the opponent might not be able to resolve the mysteries within, so there was no way to talk about a counterattack. Even if one used an attack, it would be easily broken. However, when the strength of both sides was similar, the comprehension of the Dao laws required a great deal of concentration. If there was another opponent at this time, then the deduction would naturally be insufficient. However, he was different. Compared to others, he had an advantage, and that was the remnant of the jade. When he resolved an opponent's Tao technique, he could use the remnant of the jade to deduce against another person. If this method was used against one person, then the advantage would be almost overwhelming. Even when facing two opponents of similar levels, he could still be calm. Therefore, he was currently resolving two Tao techniques at the same time. The spirit of creation had now tied itself to all the worlds. If all the worlds collapsed and he wanted to re-establish it, then he would have to gather all of Pauline. In this case, he would have to wait for all the Vedanta to return. During the wait, not only would he not be able to find the land of creation, but it would also be difficult to find the rest of Pauline's chi activity. Therefore, if Hongdu couldn't resolve this technique, once he understood the mysteries within, he would naturally do it for Hongdu. As he stared at the scene, he realized that due to the great power of the spirit of creation climbing above many of the real worlds, the influence of the real worlds on them was not shallow. Normal real worlds were fine, for spirit refinement cultivators, they would be destroyed in an instant. However, the real worlds attached to the land of creation were everlasting. If the great power of the spirit of creation seeped into them, it would not be a good thing. He pondered for a while. Although a little Whaley would not affect the Vedanta, it would have a significant impact on the spirit of creation. The spirit of creation had two purposes. One was to deal with Hongdu and the other was to infect all living beings. Obviously, it also wanted to seize the Tao technique behind the spirit of creation. Now that the Vedanta were not in the mood to care about this matter, he needed to stop it. With this thought, he released the Whaley and entered the worlds. Although the problem could not be solved if the Taoist transformed by the spirit of creation was not eliminated, once his Whaley joined in, the violent infiltration of the spirit of creation Whaley was continuously dispelled. As long as the Tao technique of the spirit of creation was not spread, it would not matter. Although many realms had been triggered, Bushutian was not involved since he was personally suppressing them. The rest of the places of fortune and the Mirror Lake were also gradually calmed down under his suppression. However, there were cultivators who adhered to the Tao technique of the spirit of creation. Because of the support of the Whaley, their cultivation would improve faster. However, in his eyes, these people were insignificant. If they stood on the side of the Luo denomination, the Virtue denomination, and the Shingism denomination, then he could rely on the Yen denomination to solve the problem. If it was necessary, he could also ask for external tributes. If they stood on the opposite side of the various Taoists, then there was no harm. The Tao technique came from battle, and with the birth of the origin jade, it was not a bad thing to have so many opponents stirring up karma. In the mountain and sea realm, Hong Yu and Ran Xiushu stayed in the Qinsang school for a few months before taking their leave. According to the original plan, their next stop should be the Earth Abyss in search of the origin Mirage Gate. However, Tian Kun said that they needed to go to the Yuhuai heavens. Ran Xiushu said, "Fellow Taoist, are you going to go to the outer heavens now? There's a denomination called the Yen denomination, and they can use the realm gate to go to the other heavens. It's convenient to go there." Hong Yu said, "When I was discussing the Tao with fellow Taoists from the Qinsang school, I heard that that person had dealings with fellow Taoists from various sects in the 9 continents. I'd like to visit them one by one before going to the Yuhuai heavens." Since he was going to search for memories, the more complete and detailed it was, the better. For a person like that, everyone must have seen different things. That way, when pieced together, the picture would be nearly complete. Ran Xiushu thought for a moment, then said, "I heard that the Clear Feather sect master, Tao Zhenhong, had a good relationship with that person. Fellow Taoist, why don't you pay him a visit?" Hong Yu nodded. After returning to the mountain and sea realm, he had heard of the Clear Feather sect in the Winged Sky continent, and it was not far from here. Suddenly, he thought of something and said, "Since we're going to this place, I might as well pay a visit to a sect on the way." Ran Xiushu said, "Which sect?" Hong Yu said in a low voice, "The Guangyuan sect." Shen Chong was from the Guangyuan sect, and Hong Yu had lost to him twice. Therefore, he wanted to pay a visit to the sect and learn some Taoist techniques. Ran Xiushu thought for a moment, then said, the current Guangyuan sect master is only in the Grotto Heaven realm, but there's a fellow Taoist Yang who has severed his mortal body not too long ago. Hong Yu said, that's good. I'll discuss Taoist techniques with that fellow Taoist. Even if that person was not a cultivator who could sever the past and the future, as long as he was a cultivator who had shed his mortal body, he would still be able to display superior Taoist techniques in the divine decree. That was enough. Ran Xiushu thought for a moment, then smiled. Anyway, he had nothing to do, and he just wanted to see what the final outcome would be. It didn't matter where he went. In fact, he was eager to make some noise, so he said, then I'll go with fellow Taoist. The Stream Wind continent was located at the south of the northern cold abyss. After the Guangyuan sect crossed over from the 9 continents, they built their sect here. Originally, this was a broken and barren continent without a name. Therefore, everyone in the sect gave this place its old name. To the west of this continent was where the Blue Feather Pavilion was, and further to the east was Pingyuan sect, which was adjacent to the outer seas. Just to the south, there was a large tribe called the Heart Butterfly tribe. Although this demon tribe had long pledged allegiance to the sects of the 9 continents and made an oath, they were still a different species after all. Therefore, the sects of the 9 continents were still wary of them. The original intention of the Guangyuan sect's establishment here was to be at the forefront to guard against this demon tribe. However, with the rise of the sects of the 9 continents, this purpose had gradually disappeared. However, if the Guangyuan sect wanted to expand outwards, because all 3 sides were on the same path, they could only continue southward, which would definitely cause conflict with the Heart Butterfly tribe. In the past, because of the existence of the Heart Butterfly tribe's demon ancestor, although she was in a deep sleep, she did not reveal anything. However, after Yang Miaosheng severed her mortal body, she had been intentionally or unintentionally invading the territory of the Heart Butterfly tribe for the past few decades. The visit of Hong Yu and Ran Xiushu made the Guangyuan sect leader Lin very surprised. Even without mentioning their identities, these 2 people were top-notch, so he personally came out to welcome them. When he heard that the 2 of them were here to visit Elder Yang Miaosheng, he first greeted them warmly, then sent people to look for them. At this moment, Hong Yu suddenly felt something and looked in a certain direction. He saw a young girl with her hair combed into 2 buns, dressed in a lake green dress, sitting on the Thousand Autumns, swaying back and forth. She looked extremely bored, but just now, he saw that there was a golden light shining from her body, blocking his sight. The next moment, he felt something and accepted it. As soon as he entered, he saw that the young girl just now was looking at him curiously. He cupped his hands and said, "Are you fellow Taoist Yang of Guangyuan sect?" "I, Hong Yu, have long heard of the reputation of Guangyuan sect, so I have specially come to pay a visit." Yang Miaosheng, on the other hand, made a sound of surprise. She sniffed at him, then used her index finger to touch her lower lip, and muttered to herself, "Is he under a talisman spell? Why doesn't it look like it?" Chapter 2253. Talisman Technique? Hong Yu pondered for a while and felt that it must have been left behind after his fight with Shinchong. A person like Shinchong would not do anything to him, nor would he bother to do so. The greatest possibility was that it was the repercussions of the perfect fusion technique. Falling from the peak was not a small matter. In battle, even a little difference would be a huge difference. Therefore, Ran Xiushu regretted that he could not fight with Shinchong when he was in perfect condition. He originally thought that the biggest problem here was the state of mind, because he had become overly cautious and conservative when fighting. This was something that could not be helped. Because every time he attacked, he would think of Shinchong's methods and would naturally be on guard against such changes. Therefore, no matter if it was the changes in his techniques or his mana, he could not use them smoothly. It was equivalent to having a crack on the originally flawless mirror, no matter how small it was, it would drag the whole thing down. Previously, he could not find a solution no matter what, so he went around visiting fellow Taoists with the intention of solving this problem. But now, it seemed that it was not just that. He said in a low voice, "I have something to ask fellow Taoist, fellow Taoist." He called out a few times, but there was no response from the other side. He looked up and saw that Yang Miaosheng had transformed into countless talisman in front of him. Her fingers were fiddling around as if she was calculating something. Sometimes, she was deep in thought, sometimes she stomped her feet in annoyance, and sometimes she was exclaiming. With one look, Hong Yu knew that she was in a state of enlightenment. It should be the so-called talisman technique that he had on him that inspired her. This was a good thing, because she might be able to solve his problem. Therefore, he did not disturb her, but waited quietly at the side. But after a long time, he saw that Yang Miaosheng had no intention of stopping, and he felt that something was wrong. They had stayed here for too long. After a mortal metamorphosis cultivator entered the inexplicable state, he could perform countless calculations, but this also consumed his divine will. Once the divine will was used up, he would need to use his own origin to replenish it. He was a cultivator who had severed his past and future body, so naturally, his divine decree was abundant. However, Yang Miaosheng had only severed her mortal body, so the divine decree she possessed could not be compared to his. If she continued to immerse herself in this, it would cause some problems, and he did not want to see that happen. He called out twice more, and Yang Miaosheng came back to her senses, but she did not seem to be acting strangely. She bowed and said, "Thank you for reminding me." She looked indifferent, but in her heart, she was screaming, "How embarrassing, how embarrassing." Hong Yu said, "It's nothing." He looked at Yang Miaosheng and saw that there was nothing wrong with her. But if something happened, it wouldn't be good. So he said, "Since I'm a guest at your sect leader's place, why don't I come and meet you later?" Yang Miaosheng blinked her eyes and said, "You don't have to worry about me, my friend. I have the spirit-nourishing talisman planted in my Dharmakaya. As long as I'm in the mountain gate, I won't be able to use up my spirit in a short period of time." "Is that so?" Hong Yu pondered for a moment, then asked, "Fellow Taoist, just now, you seem to have seen a talisman technique on my body. I wonder what's going on. Could you tell me?" Yang Miaosheng didn't hide anything and said, "There's nothing that I can't say." "That's because there are traces of talisman techniques in your divine qi," she said with a face full of curiosity. "Where did you get this from?" Hong Yu said, "Before I came here, I once sparred with a fellow Taoist from your sect. His Tao technique was much better than mine, and he defeated me with one move. Maybe I was invaded by his divine art. According to what fellow Taoist said, maybe this really is some kind of talisman technique." Yang Miaosheng was confused. "He's from the same sect as my Guangyuan sect? However, there doesn't seem to be such a person in my Guangyuan sect." "No." She suddenly widened her eyes. There was no such person now, but it didn't mean that there was no such person in the past. She remembered that there was indeed a very powerful senior in her family who had ascended to another world when she was still in the 9 continents. She asked tentatively, "Taoist priest, are you talking about Elder Shen?" Hong Yu nodded silently and said, "That's him." Yang Miaosheng's eyes lit up and she said excitedly, "No wonder, no wonder. Elder Shen is my Guangyuan sect senior." Even though he carried on the past and created a new mystical technique, no matter what, he still entered the path of Tao through talismans. Since fellow Taoist was hit by a divine art or a Tao technique, that means you were hit by a talisman technique. However, there's still something wrong. She pointed at her lips again and her eyes lit up. She hurriedly asked, "The level of divine art that fellow Taoist was hit by, was it sent by Elder Shen's divine will?" Hong Yu couldn't help but look at her. He was rather impressed in his heart. He didn't say the exact details, but Yang Miaosheng was able to deduce the truth with just a few clues. Even though her cultivation wasn't high, she was indeed quite capable. He said, "That's right." Yang Miaosheng said, "That's right. That senior's divine will was actually kept by fellow Taoist, that's why I was able to see the traces. However, if this continues, fellow Taoist's original cultivation will definitely be affected." Hong Yu was silent for a moment and asked, "Does fellow Taoist have a solution?" "This is very troublesome." Yang Miaosheng's eyes turned and she said, "But it's not that there's no way. Why don't fellow Taoists stay for a few more days?" She waved her hand again and said, "But it's all up to fellow Taoist, I won't force you." She pretended to be indifferent on the surface, but in her heart, she was thinking, hurry up and agree, hurry up and agree. Life is so boring, how can I not investigate this matter properly? Hong Yu frowned. He had a bad feeling in his heart, but Yang Miaosheng had seen the real problem in his body and had a solution, so he didn't want to miss it. After all, he didn't want to have a flaw in his own body when he fought with the shadow master of Xian Yuantian heaven, so he said, "Since fellow Taoist Yang has invited me, I'll stay here for a few more days." In Qinghuan Palace, after some calculations, Zhang Yan had deciphered the Tao techniques of Fengdu and the Taoist transformed from the spirit of creation. In other words, if he were to make a move now, he could break the magical powers of both of them. But it couldn't be said that the Tao techniques of both of them were not brilliant. Both of them were fighting, guarding against each other, and the Weili were still colliding with each other. Now that he had no such burden, it was relatively easy for him to decipher them. Taoist Fengdu seemed to have turned a blind eye to the treasure light around him, and the Tao sound from his mouth didn't stop. Instead, it became louder. Xiang Zhu and the others persisted under the treasure light of the Taoist for a while, but they found that the pressure was not as great as they had imagined. Although the Taoist had made use of countless real worlds, in their eyes, the real worlds would be destroyed in an instant. Even though they would be reborn due to the collision of various mighty forces, there was still a limit to it. After a certain point, there would be no more improvement. At this time, they gradually noticed that Taoist Fengdu's aura was constantly rising. After discussing with each other, they believed that Fengdu was gradually gaining the upper hand. If this continued, if there were no changes, the moment the Tao sound ended, the Taoist opposite them would be banished into eternal silence, and the spirit of creation would lose a part of its power forever, never to be recovered. However, they didn't think that it would be so easy to take down the incarnation of the spirit of creation. Even if they could restrain it with their Tao techniques, before it was banished, it was very likely that the Taoist would fight to the death and overturn everything. Even if they won, they would lose more than they would gain. Once everything collapsed, there would be no way to find a way to complete the Tao technique. When the spirit of creation's true body descended, they might not be able to win. Zhang Yan also thought that the spirit of creation would not be willing to be banished so easily. However, his eyes were not on the Taoist, but on Xiang Zhu and the others. He had suspected that the Tao technique might be replaced among the four. If it came to a critical moment, it might not be able to help but attack in an attempt to save the situation. At this moment, after a long period of calculation, Taoist Fengdu was the first to decipher the Tao technique. His eyes shone brightly, and he waved his sleeve heavily. The treasure light in the surroundings suddenly dimmed, and in the blink of an eye, all the light retreated until it fell into nothingness. Taoist Fengdu's spirits were lifted. Previously, he had been burdened by the treasure light, so he had to slow down his chanting. Now that he was free, the Tao sound immediately rose again. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. It was not unreasonable for this person to be so confident earlier. He did have some ability. Even though he was in Bushutian, he could feel that the Tao sound was gradually coming to an end. If the spirit of creation had any killing moves, it was about time to reveal them. At this moment, Hongdu transmitted a message with his divine will, "The four of you, go and watch the incarnation. Don't let anything happen over there." When Xiang Zhu and the others heard this, they didn't dare to be negligent. They immediately focused their attention on the purple-robed Taoist. The spirit of creation was about to be expelled, but now was also the most dangerous time. Without thinking too much, they knew that it would definitely do something, and it was very likely to use the purple-robed Taoist to make a fuss. When the Taoist saw that his Tao technique was broken, he stretched out his hand and grabbed. Strands of colored glaze immortal light were born from nothingness like silk ribbons, and then fell into everything. Taoist Fengdu felt his body stiffen, as if he was trapped in a cocoon. He immediately judged that this divine power was not as difficult to deal with as it was just now, nor was it too threatening. However, no matter what, he still needed to calculate and decipher it before he could break it. Therefore, This method was undoubtedly to hold him back so that it would be convenient for him to use other tricks. At this moment, Xiang Ju and the others were also trapped. Because of the difference in their Dao techniques, just now, they were helpless against the treasured light, and there was no way for them to break this technique. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. He was also affected by the Daoist's Weili, but he was backed by Bushutian. After all, the Weili was not like the lotus of creation, which could quietly seep in. After passing through many obstacles, it was already very weak when it fell on his body. At this moment, he didn't perform any deduction. His body of strength only struggled slightly, and he got rid of the restraint. At the same time, the aura outside his body fluctuated slightly and surged continuously. The mighty power of Bushutian and the land of creation had been mobilized by him. If the Taoists will wanted to destroy everything, and Taoist Feng Du could not stop it, then he could release these powers with just a thought and use them to suppress the Taoists' mighty power. Chapter 2254. After the Daoist transformed by the creation spirit trapped everyone, he spread his arms and flung his sleeves. In an instant, everyone present felt an insurmountable gap between them and the others. Even their divine wills could not be transmitted. Even though Daoist Feng Du was restrained at this moment, it was unable to obstruct his judgment of the situation of the battle. When he saw that Daoist Feng Du repeatedly utilized such abilities, he instantly knew that Daoist Feng Du was unable to deal with it before the voice of the Tao came to an end. Otherwise, there would be utterly no need for this. What he was doing at the moment was not to seek a way out, but to fight for as many results as possible before he was expelled. After the Daoist used his magical power, the treasure light on his body turned and shrouded Xiangjue and the others. He directed most of the Weili on his body towards them. Xiangjue and the others immediately felt the pressure increase. Previously, the Daoist was just casually suppressing them, and his main target was Hongdu. Now, it seemed that he was targeting them. Hongdu was now trapped and could not come out before the Dao method was unraveled. Obviously, he could not help them. However, they were not afraid. After all, as a great virtue, even if the Weili was not complete, it would not be so easy to take them down. As long as they could survive this, even if Fengdu could not break through the barrier, once the Dao voice ended, the Daoist would be banished into eternal silence. The Daoist stretched out his finger and pointed. The qi dynamic of Xiangjue and the others suddenly became chaotic. This was what had seeped into their bodies when they were summoning the creation spirit into the Weili. However, this was unavoidable. Fortunately, they were already vigilant about this and did not panic. They all turned their Weili to suppress it. At this moment, the foreign Weili was still constantly invading them, and there was a qi dynamic inside. It could be said that they were being pressured both inside and outside. However, they knew that there was no way out and they had to find a way to endure it. At this moment, the layer of glazed light on the Daoist's face dimmed, and two glowing eyes appeared. At the same time, the qi dynamic of his body suddenly rose to a level. At this moment, Xiangjue and the others were alarmed. Before they could feel anything, their minds were in a trance. They found that there seemed to be a bottomless hole in their divine wills. Their minds felt like they were sinking, and they could not stop themselves. They could only watch as they slowly slid into the hole. Daoist Feng Du looked at the scene coldly. It was clearly a critical moment. No matter what the Daoist wanted to do, he must find a way to stop it. As he tried his best to deduce, he was soon able to resolve the Taoist technique that was binding his body. However, even with that, there was still an obstacle that the Taoist had set up in front of him. Right now, he could just toss the four of them aside and ignore them. However, he felt that since he was the one who had recruited these people to work for him, he couldn't allow them to be taken away. Even if his Dao voice slowed down slightly because of this, he still had to do it. His qi will changed, and a Hongdo walked out of his body. He took a step forward and slammed into the barrier, instantly dispersing the mighty force within. This was because he could see that the Daoist was only using Weili to block it. There was no need for him to dispel it, so he used the most direct method to break it. Although he had only broken the barrier between him and the Daoist, it was enough. Once his Weili pressed on, the Taoist could no longer pose a threat to Xiangjue and the others. When the Taoist saw this, he waved his sleeves and set up layers of barriers to stop the Weili from coming over. Hongdu sneered. It seemed that the Taoist had no more tricks up his sleeves. He controlled the Weili to surge forward, breaking through the barriers, and his chanting became louder. After fighting like this for a long time, the Taoist Fengdu finally came to an end. The Taoist clearly foresaw what would happen to him. After setting up layers of barriers, he took out a spell, and the light on his body suddenly shone. With a loud bang, endless Weili exploded in the surroundings. The expressions of Xiangjue and the others changed. They thought that he was trying to destroy everything, but in the next moment, they found that they were wrong. He did not do this. Instead, like the previous incarnation of the Weili, he collapsed and threw his Weili into the many worlds. Fengdu's chanting had already come to an end. As the last Taoist Fengdu spoke, the Weili spirits of creation that had yet to fall were driven into eternal silence. However, because he was a step too late, a small portion of them escaped, so it could only be said that he had completed half of his mission. When Zhang Yan saw this, his eyes flashed. It wasn't difficult for him to discern that this sort of escape wasn't something that the Taoist formed from the mighty power of the spirit of creation had planned from the beginning. Instead, his actions were naturally in line with the Tao. When faced with an irreversible situation, he would instinctively find a path that was beneficial to him. His heart stirred slightly, and he couldn't help but ponder. From the looks of it, the spirit of creation's way of doing things was traceable, and this might be because the person wasn't the original. From the looks of it, if the method was appropriate, he might be able to make use of this to do something. On the other hand, Xiangjue and the others did not see any changes until the spirit of creation's Weili dissipated. It could not be said that there was no substitute among the four of them, because from the situation, even if someone stood on the Taoist side, it would be difficult to change anything. The Taoist might have seen this and decided not to use it. Apart from that, there was another possibility, and that was that it was not the original spirit of creation and could not use the substitute. As for the truth, it would take time to determine it. Fengdu stood alone in the field, his expression extremely solemn. Although he had successfully expelled the incarnation of the spirit of creation, he was very dissatisfied because a small portion of the Weili spirit was left behind. He felt that there was a thorn in his heart, and it was very uncomfortable. At this time, Xiangjue came up and said, "Congratulations, fellow Taoist, for driving the incarnation of the spirit of creation into eternal silence." Fengdu said coldly, "Do you think this battle can be considered complete?" Xiangjue said with a smile, "Even if a part of the incarnation of the spirit of creation escaped, most of it was destroyed by fellow Taoist. Its original body will never be able to recover this part of the power, and the threat it will face in the future will be greatly reduced. As for the completion that fellow Taoist said, how can there be a truly perfect thing in the world?" Hongdu raised his head and said, "That may not be impossible." Xiangjue said, "What do you plan to do?" Looking at the countless lives and deaths, Taoist Fengdu said, "As long as everything is destroyed, then the power that the spirit of creation has sneaked into it can naturally be destroyed." When Xiangjue and the others heard this, they couldn't help but be shocked. It was not easy for them to protect everything and expel the spirit of creation from the Weili spirit. Why did Hongdu suddenly want to do this? Wei Ming said, "Fellow Taoist, we can slowly find a way to deal with the scattered Weili spirit, but once everything is broken, we can only wait for all the Vedanta to return and gather all the creation pollen. Otherwise, before that, we won't be able to find the essence of creation, and we won't be able to feel the missing Tao. This is obviously disadvantageous to fighting against the spirit of creation." Heng Wu also advised, "That's right, fellow Taoist, you must be careful. What fell today is only a Weili incarnation of the spirit of creation, and the original body is still behind it. It's not worth doing this." Although everyone was advising, it was all useless because Hongdu didn't take their words to heart at all. He felt that the opinions of Xiangjue and the others weren't important at all. Just now, during the battle, the four of them didn't have much use, so in his eyes, there was no difference whether they were there or not. He snorted coldly and said, "If the original body of the spirit of creation comes, I will naturally fight against it." "What are you all worried about?" Heng Wu questioned, "But what if fellow Taoist is defeated?" Feng Du said, "What a joke. How can I lose?" Everyone had a headache. Heng Du wasn't bragging, nor was he arrogant, but he was saying something that was natural. Before he really failed, he would never think that he would fail. Wei Ming said, "But fellow Taoist, you also said before that you will lead us to destroy the spirit of creation, which means that this matter isn't completely under your control. You misjudged this time, so how can you guarantee that you will succeed next time?" As soon as these words came out, the rest of the people secretly cursed in their hearts. Weren't these words urging Heng Do to do such a thing? As expected, Heng Do glanced at him and said, "That's why I need to correct this mistake now. As long as I destroy everything, the great power of the spirit of creation will be destroyed as well. Then, there won't be such a thing, right?" Xiang Jue could see that Heng Du had clearly made up his mind. At this time, it was impossible to persuade him back. He immediately transmitted his divine will to everyone, "Fellow Taoists, the situation isn't right. We must stop Feng Du no matter what. We can't let him destroy Zhu Yu. Otherwise, how can we fight against the spirit of creation?" Wei Ming said, "Even if we have to fight with numbers, we can't be Feng Du's opponent. If he uses the Dao technique just now, we may be driven into eternal silence." Everyone's hearts trembled. This was very possible, and they wavered for a moment. If they backed down, Heng Do would definitely not deliberately target them. Heng Wu thought about it and said, "But Heng Du is so powerful, that Daoist Xianyuan may not agree to fight against him. Plus, he still has Bu Shutian to protect him. Even if Zhu Yu is destroyed, it won't affect him." Xiang Jue changed his mind and said, "Fellow Daoist Ji Zhuang, can you say a few words to Daoist Xianyuan and tell him about the power of this?" Ji Zhuang said in a low voice, "There's no need to beg. If that person is willing, he will definitely protect Zhu Yu. If not, no matter how you beg, it will be useless." The four of them discussed and the Wei Li on their bodies surged. They rushed towards Heng Du one step ahead. Heng Du showed a look of disdain. With a wave of his sleeve, a vast Wei Li pressed against the four of them. At the same time, the qi dynamic on his body fluctuated. It looked like once it exploded, Zhu Yu would be destroyed. Zhang Yan had a clear view of the situation here. Daoist Feng Du said that he wanted to destroy Zhu Yu. In this way, he could destroy the creation spirit Wei Li. He immediately knew that it was not a joke. He really wanted to do it. Just now, after he understood Feng Du's Dao technique, he had a slight understanding of the latter's Dao. Only when one satisfied his own heart and did what he believed in, could his Dao technique be able to improve. Even his fighting ability would become stronger. But if he could not let his heart be free, then not only would his Dao technique not be able to improve, it might even become stagnant. This was the most fundamental reason why he insisted on destroying the remaining creation spirit Wei Li. But no matter what, he could not let him do this. So he took a step forward and walked out of Bushutian. Chapter 22:55. Although Xiang Ju and the others were suppressed in the Wei Li, they soon realized that they were not completely powerless to fight back. Previously, when they were fighting against the incarnation of the creation spirit Wei Li, they were always at a disadvantage. That was because the creation spirit could steal the Tao of the Wei Li of great virtue and had a natural advantage. As long as there was no Wei Li that was equal to or similar to the creation spirit, they would definitely be suppressed. But now, it was not the case. Heng Du was also a great virtue like them, but he did not have the ability to steal the Wei Li. Although his cultivation of Tao was higher than theirs, he did not have the ability to do so like the creation spirit. When the four saw the situation, they were slightly relieved. They did not have the confidence to defeat Heng Du, but now they just wanted to stop him and prevent him from destroying everything. This was still possible. Taoist Feng Du was a little impatient at the moment. He wanted to suppress the 4 of them and then do what he thought he should do, but he did not expect to be stopped. Although the 4 of them were not as strong as him, it was not easy to subdue them. At least, he could not block them as easily as the creation spirit. He was indeed better than the 4 of them in the Whaley, but now he could not directly surpass them and wait for the Whaley to destroy everything. Most importantly, he did not achieve his goal of destroying the incarnation of the Whaley of the creation spirit this time, causing his mind to be disturbed. Therefore, the operation of his Tao was sluggish, and it was not as smooth as before. It could be said that not only did he not improve, but it had also decreased. Hongdu wanted to relax his Whaley a few times, but he could not do it every time. Although the 4 of them could not defeat him, it was much easier for them to stop him. This made him more and more annoyed, and he said coldly, "All of you, get out of my way, don't hinder me. Otherwise, don't blame me for being rude." He suddenly stopped and picked up a spell. Suddenly, a shadow of Fengdu that looked exactly like him walked out of his body, but it crossed the layers of Whaley in an instant and rushed toward the 4 of them. In this short period of time, the 4 of them could not understand the Tao, nor could they see the mystery in it. There was no other way but to avoid it. Just now, when they wanted to avoid it, they realized that Hongdu's Whaley was expanding outward. If they did not stop it, everything would be destroyed. They had no choice but to stop it again. But this delay allowed the shadow to rush over and enter Xiangjue's body. Xiangjue immediately felt that his Whaley was in a mess, as if there was another person competing with him for the power of the Whaley. He quickly gathered his mind and tried to suppress it. At the same time, 3 more shadows walked out from Hongdu's side, heading towards Wei Ming, Heng Wu, and Ji Zhuang respectively. Under the influence of his mighty power, no one could avoid it, and all of them were submerged into the bodies of the shadows. Wei Ming and the other 2 also felt that it was difficult to use their own mighty power, so they had no choice but to cast spells to expel it. After using this method, Hongdu seemed to be unable to attack, but he did not intend to do so. He was only temporarily trapping the 4 of them. In this way, he could free up his hands and overturn everything. When it was done, even if the 4 of them escaped, they would not be entangled in this matter anymore. He stretched out his hand and pointed it upward. Suddenly, the boundless Whaley surged violently under his control. It seemed that everything would collapse and everything would be destroyed in the next moment. But at that moment, he seemed to feel something and stopped what he was doing. He turned around and saw a Taoist with Qi under his feet and 5 lights on his back walking out of the sky. His expression became serious. He stared at the person and asked, "Taoist Xianyuan, do you also want to stop me?" He was not polite to Xiangjue and the others because their strength was not as good as his. But he could not feel the specific strength of Zhang Yan. He only knew that Zhang Yan was not weaker than him, so he was careful with his words. In a sense, it could be said that he respected the strong and bullied the weak, but for him, there was nothing to be embarrassed about. His own way was to follow his heart. He would do whatever he wanted and do whatever he wanted. Most people would treat those who were powerful and those who were weak differently. It was just that he expressed it more directly and thoroughly. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "I cannot interfere with what you did before, but if you want to destroy everything, it involves too many things, so I can't just sit and watch." Fengdu said, "Why do you worry about this? You have Bushutian in your hand. Even if everything is damaged, you still have a place to live. But the spirit of creation, the Whaley, is different. If I don't get rid of them this time, the next time the real body comes, these Whaley will return to my body. That will be even more difficult to deal with, so I have to do it." Zhang Yan said, "Ask yourself, is this really the only way to get rid of the Whaley? We can think of another way to get rid of them." Fengdu said disapprovingly, "How long will it take? It is not as good as getting rid of them once and for all." Zhang Yan said indifferently, "Let's not talk about this anymore. Once everything is destroyed, the missing Tao will be hard to find. It is too much of a price to pay." Fengdu said, "This is just a small matter." Zhang Yan said with a deep gaze, "It may seem like a small matter to you, but your action is blocking everyone from finding the Tao, and it is also blocking me from finding the Tao. How can I not stop you? Hongdu's expression turned cold, and he said, if that is the case, then I have to offend you. Facing his enemy, Zhang Yan, his attitude became serious again, and his mouth began to chant the Tao voice again. Zhang Yan noticed that the voice this person was chanting this time was different from the Tao voice he used to expel the spirit of creation. It felt even more grand and deep, and he immediately understood that this person's Tao voice could be different for different people. So, the method of dispelling it would probably be different as well. Perhaps the only result here was the same, and that was to send him into eternal silence. It wasn't difficult for him to break through this technique, and he just had to decipher it again. However, he wasn't interested in this at all. Because so long as the Tao voice hadn't been chanted to the end, then it wouldn't pose any threat to him. Before that, he just had to defeat his opponent, so he didn't have to pay any attention to it at all. With a thought, a sword light suddenly floated and slashed towards Hongdu. After he sacrificially refined the Qinghong sword pill, it had already obtained the transformation of being and non-being. In other words, it could appear from being to non-being. If there was no obstruction, it could appear on the opponent in an instant with a thought, and the entire process could be ignored. It was just that Dada was protected by the Weili, so it was impossible for it to jump to the most vital part. But this also depended on the strength of the Weili on both sides. If it were Xiangju and the rest, the sword light might reach them in an instant, but if it were Hongdu, the resistance would be much greater. Hongdu saw the sword light that swept over, and instantly felt a serious threat. He understood that if he was hit, he would definitely lose a part of his Tao. So he stood still, but an apparition that looked exactly like him walked out from his body, and took the initiative to face the sword light. The sword light slashed across the apparition, and the apparition immediately shattered, along with the sword light. However, there was more than one sword light. Then, there were more sword lights that slashed over, and outside his body, there were apparitions that walked out continuously. For a moment, it was as if there were countless Hongdu. Under the frequent falling sword light, they constantly dissipated and constantly reappeared. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed slightly. Just now, Hongdu was fighting with Xiangju and the rest, and in addition to his battle with the apparition of the spirit of creation, he had already seen this kind of supernatural power twice. It was just that this method was not like the Tao voice and the treasure light released by the spirit of creation. His own Weili had not directly collided with it, so he had not calculated it before. But now that he was facing it, there was naturally a way to break it. After a brief calculation, the Xian Qi in his body surged, and suddenly turned into a big hand, which reached for Hongdu. Hongdu used the same trick again, and released another apparition that rushed up. Under the grasp of the Xian Qi hand, the apparition shattered like a bubble. However, the Xian Qi hand that should have been shattered together with the apparition was still there, and there was no sign of it being dissolved. Instead, it continued to press down on him. Hongdu's expression froze. This situation clearly meant that Zhang Yan had only touched the apparition once, and in a short period of time, he had solved the Tao within it. He calculated once more, and then released another phantom. This time, it collided with the profound energy hand and successfully eliminated it at the same time. Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows. Hongdu was indeed somewhat capable. Although the method he used seemed to be exactly the same as before, in fact, the Tao within it had undergone some very ingenious changes. Of course, the fundamental Tao of a person would not change. Only the external appearance would change. If such an enemy wanted to break his method, he would have to resolve and calculate it every time. This was much more brilliant than the rigid methods of Xiangju and the others. In fact, if Xiangju and the others were at full power, they might have been able to do this. However, they were at a disadvantage in that their return was not as complete as Hongdu's. The difference was not just a little bit, but a difference in level. Zhang Yan thought for a moment. Although they had only exchanged 2 blows, through his previous observation and what he had now, he had more or less figured out the strengths and weaknesses of Hongdu's Tao. Hongdu was obviously not afraid of strong attacks, but he did not have much of a way to trap and block it. The incarnation of the spirit of creation had used this kind of magical power on him several times, but he had not been able to break it in time. Although this was not a problem in the eyes of others of the same generation, in his opinion, it was an extremely obvious shortcoming. With a turn of his mind, the five-colored brilliance behind him turned and shrouded Fengdu. Fengdu's expression changed. He only felt that there was infinite Tao in the five-colored brilliance, and he could not solve it in a short period of time. Therefore, he released apparitions again and again, but the five-colored brilliance did not stop rotating. It appeared and disappeared as it went. The apparitions were thrown into it, but they could not stir up any waves. He suddenly realized that Zhang Yan's method was brilliant, and he could not dodge it at all. However, he could also judge that this should be a trapping method, so he took out a formula and guarded his mind. At this moment, when the five-colored brilliance fell, in just a moment, there was no trace of him in the silence. Chapter 2256. As soon as Zhang Yan retrieved Hongdou, the five-colored radiance disappeared as well. Hongdou was now trapped in his Tao. However, being trapped in it did not mean that one was defenseless. If the latter's power was higher than his, it was possible for him to force his way out with some effort. However, Hongdou was obviously not at such a level. Unless he could decipher the Taoist law in it, he could not get out. It was just that the five-elemental true light was constantly rotating, and the Tao technique was also changing endlessly. Even before you could decipher it, the Tao technique that you saw would change into another form, and you would have to deduce it from the beginning. Therefore, it was not easy to get out. The most amazing thing about this place was that as the trapped person continued to decipher and deduce, his or her Tao art would gradually be exposed, and it would be known to Zhang Yan. Moreover, the deeper his understanding was, the more targeted changes there would be, and the more difficult it would be for the trapped person to decipher. Therefore, once one was trapped in the five-colored radiance, if one did not get out as soon as possible, the chances of getting out would become smaller. When the trapped person tried his best and still could not get out, he would be at the mercy of Zhang Yan. Of course, it was not like he did not have any burden here. He had to share a part of the Weili to suppress it. Fortunately, with the suppression of the mighty force, when the person trapped here was completely cut off from all connections, he only needed to push them gently to send them into eternal silence. Whether Hongdou could get out or not, it was hard for him to judge. Therefore, he put it aside for now and turned to look at Ji Zhuang and the others. Ji Zhuang and the others were entangled by the shadow. They wanted to break free as soon as possible, but when they saw Zhang Yan make his move, they all slowed down. They did not want to get involved in the battle between the two. When they saw Hongdou being taken away by the five-colored radiance, they were all shocked. However, they could also tell that Hongdou had not been banished into eternal silence. Otherwise, the Weili that trapped them would have disappeared as well. It would not have remained in their bodies. However, this time, Zhang Yan only needed a few moves to subdue Hong, and it seemed that he had not used his full strength. This made them very fearful. After observing for a while, Zhang Yan realized that the supernatural power that Hongdu used to trap Ji Zhuang and the others looked like an illusion, but it was different from what Dozhan had used. It was a different method, but it still relied on the changes of Tao. Therefore, this was not a difficult task for him. With a slight deduction, he knew how to break it. Next, he waved his sleeve and moved the mighty power that trapped Xiangjue and the others away. Xiangju and the others felt a wave of relief wash over them. They looked at each other. Ji Zhuang was the first to step forward. He cupped his fists and said, "Fellow Taoist, thank you for helping us escape. May I ask?" He asked tentatively, "Where did fellow Taoist Fengdu go?" Zhang Yan said indifferently, "I'm just sending him to a place for the time being. If he makes up his mind and promises not to overturn everything, I'll let him go." Ji Zhuang and the other three looked at each other and said, "In our opinion, Hongdu will not change his mind so easily." Zhang Yan said, "If he doesn't change his mind, I'll deal with him." Ji Zhuang was finally relieved. He said, "Then I'll leave it to you, fellow Taoist." Heng Wu said, "Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, How should we deal with the wily spirits of creation that have wandered into the various worlds? If we can deal with this matter, I believe fellow Taoist Fengdu will not be so fixated on this matter. There were still less than half of the wily left. If they were not eliminated, when the spirits of creation returned, they would only become more powerful. Especially with the birth and destruction of the present world, the whaley that had sunk into it had long become one with the various worlds. They also knew that Hongdu's method of destroying the various worlds was the simplest and most effective method. No matter how deep the whaley hid, it would be useless. But the consequences were too great, so they would not consider it. Zhang Yan said, "What do you think about this?" Xiang Ju said, "I have an idea. I wonder if it will work." Zhang Yan said, "Go ahead." Xiang Ju considered his words before saying, "Fellow Taoists and I have used the bodies of the spirit of creation to enter the world. Fellow Taoists should know about this. From this, we can see that when the mighty power of the spirit of creation is without an owner, it will naturally pursue its original Tao." He looked at the three of them, then at Zhang Yan, and said, "We can establish a great world. This world can connect all the realms and worlds, and we can put all the spirits of creation that we can see into it. They can cultivate and spread their Tao. This way, they will definitely be able to draw the whaley here. When the time is right, we can capture them in one fell swoop." Wei Ming thought for a while and said, "With just a few spirits of creation, how many whaley can we draw?" Xiang Ju said, "Don't we still have the incarnation of the whaley that we suppressed? Since we can use this person to bring the whaley spirits of creation into the world, we can also capture the whaley from the various worlds." Heng Wu thought for a while and nodded. "In that case, this method is indeed feasible." Ji Zhuang looked at Zhang Yan and said, "Now let's see what fellow Taoist Xianyuan has to say." Zhang Yan smiled faintly. He knew that Ji Zhuang and the others had not forgotten about the idea of sharing the land of creation. This united day and connecting all worlds might be to solve the problem of the whaley spirits of creation, but if they followed this method, they would also open the door to the land of creation. He would not give them the chance to do so. He said indifferently, "This method is useful, but I will find a way to remove the mighty power of the creation spirit from Busu Tian and the land of creation. There is no need to contact the first bureau." Xiang Ju knew that things would not be so easy, but he was just testing the waters. Seeing that this method did not work, he brought up another matter. "Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, in order to stop the spirit of creation, we have done our best. Just now, in order to stop Fengdu from overturning the various worlds, we have also done our best. This should prove that we are not related to the spirit of creation, right? Regardless of whether it was to find the missing path or to establish a great world, they had to find the place where the essence of creation was located here." However, they were worried that Zhang Yan would use the excuse that they might be the spirit of creation and take it away. If they could prove themselves now, then they would not have to worry about this matter in the future. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "This actually cannot prove anything. Let me ask you, when fellow Taoist Fengdu was fighting with the spirit of creation, if one of you suddenly interfered, what could you have done?" Later on, stopping fellow Taoist Fengdu was also beneficial to the spirit of creation, so this cannot prove anything. However, what you said is somewhat reasonable. A big domain does indeed need a land of creation to maintain, but this matter is not urgent. We can talk about it later. Wei Ming seemed to want to say something, but Xiang Ju said, "Fellow Taoist, don't be in a hurry. Since this Taoist Xianyuan cares about the various worlds, then he will not let the spirit of creation continue to be infected by the whaley. There is no harm in waiting." After saying this, Zhang Yan turned and left. Because Fengdu had not been completely suppressed, he did not return to Busu Tian for the time being. Instead, he landed in the fixed world that he had established. After this battle, Busu Tian, the Mirror Lake, and the other places of creation had been contaminated with the mighty power of the spirit of creation. Most of it had been erased by him, but there was still a lot that could not be cleaned up and could be handed over to his subordinates. Thus, he immediately sent down a decree. After doing this, he turned his gaze to the 5 elements' true light. At this moment, Fengdu found himself in a vast domain. What he saw in front of him was a sea of five-colored light, which was constantly circulating and evolving into infinite changes. Every single time he deduced, he would have no choice but to give up before he truly obtained an outcome. This was because the Tao art he deduced had already changed. He discerned that Zhang Yan possessed the same ability to internally determine and externally change just like him, and it wasn't just that, Zhang Yan was even more brilliant than him. After trying many times, he found that his chances of getting out were very slim, and his connection with the various worlds had begun to weaken. If he persisted, even if Zhang Yan did not continue to exert pressure on him, he might still fall into eternal silence. After determining his possible ending, he did not hesitate and immediately activated his divine will, trying to communicate with Zhang Yan. Zhang Yan sensed some movement in the divine will, smiled slightly, and then turned inexplicably. At this moment, Taoist Fengdu was already standing there. When he saw Zhang Yan appear, he cupped his hands and said, "Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, will you let me out if I promise to give up overturning the various worlds?" Zhang Yan nodded slightly and said, "I have no enmity with you, fellow Taoist. I have already explained the reason why I stopped you. As long as fellow Taoist is willing to give up this thought, I can let you out." Fengdu was very straightforward. "Since I have lost to fellow Taoist, I am willing to follow fellow Taoist's will. If fellow Taoist lets me go, I will no longer cling to this thought." Others might think that people like Fengdu would definitely go all the way and refuse to admit defeat no matter what. In fact, this was not the case. Hongdo would not reason with those who were weaker than him. However, if he met someone who was stronger than him, or even someone who could suppress him, then he would naturally feel that the person's words were more reasonable. Zhang Yan said, "Before that, there is one more thing." Fengdu said, "Fellow Taoist, please speak." Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoist, Creation Pauline, can I have a look at it?" Fengdu did not even ask the reason behind it. He directly waved his hand and summoned Creation Pauline, and casually sent it over. Zhang Yan took Creation Pauline, plucked a lotus petal from it, and returned it to Fengdu. Although Fengdu was a little puzzled, he did not ask the purpose of this, and only said, "May I go out?" Zhang Yan nodded slightly. He was not afraid that Fengdu would go back on his words. Although Fengdu might be more cautious next time after being trapped by the five elements' true light, Zhang Yan could still take him down even if he did not use this method. Moreover, Fengdu's existence in this world was far better than banishing him into eternal silence. In order to fight against the true body of the spirit of creation, he still needed Fengdu's strength. Thus, with a thought, the surrounding five-colored lights suddenly collapsed, and Fengdu was sent out. Chapter 2257. After Zhang Yan retracted the five elements' true light, he came out of the time freeze. Fengdu was outside and had not left yet. He sensed that Zhang Yan let him go so easily, so he asked, "Do you have anything else to say?" Zhang Yan said, "I do have something to discuss with fellow Taoist. Everyone needs to be protected, but the mighty force of the spirit of creation needs to be removed. Fellow Taoist Xiang Ju believes that we can work together to create a large domain that connects all worlds. Then, we can throw the incarnation of the spirit of creation that we captured into this domain. This way, we can find a way to attract those mighty forces." Fengdu did not care about the process, so he asked, "Do you think it's feasible?" His attitude was very straightforward. "Since you are strong, you have the final say." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "We can give it a try, but one of the four may be the creation spirit's incarnation, so it's not appropriate to let him handle this matter. But if Fengdu is in charge, then we can be more at ease." Before the mighty power of the spirit of creation arrived, he had actually thought about the possibility that Hongdu might be the body that was being borrowed. Hence, he was prepared to step forward and suppress the situation should there be any changes. But it turned out that Fengdu was not the incarnation, otherwise he would not have to fight against the creation spirit to this extent. Although Xiangjue and the others also participated in the battle, their influence and role were too small, so it was hard to get rid of the suspicion on them. Fengdu said, "I agree to this." Zhang Yan said, "Then I will have to trouble you." Fengdu cupped his hands and left the place. With just a shift, he came near Xiangjue and the others. Xiangjue and the others were shocked to see him suddenly appear, and then they were puzzled. Why did he come out again? Could it be that Taoist Xianyuan failed to suppress him, so he came out again? However, they quickly came back to their senses. The truth shouldn't be like this. From the very beginning, Fengdu's objective was to destroy all beings and kill the creation spirit Weili along with it. Now, no one could stop him. However, he didn't do such a thing. It seemed like he had given up on this idea. They breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that Taoist Xianyuan had suppressed him. If that was the case, there was no need to fight him. Hong Do glanced at the four of them and said, I heard that you all want to build a region of creation to attract the spirits of creation to the Weili. Xiang Ju looked at the others and said, that's right, that's exactly what we plan to do. Does fellow Fengdu have any opinions? Hong Do was a little impatient and said, I have no objections. Since you have already decided, then hurry up and get started. In Buxu Heaven, this time, the creation spirit Weili had invaded the world. It naturally had a deep impact on the bodies of the creation spirit that had descended into the world. However, most of these people were subdued by Yan Jiao, or simply like Dan Yi and Meng Hu, who followed their own Tao as the righteous path, so the impact wasn't great. But this time, the difference was that these Weili had formed Dharma carvings of creation in various parts of the world. This could be seen by living beings in the world, and they could learn Tao from it. Although this was not as good as the Dharma carvings of creation prepared by the creation spirit, and many parts of it were scattered, but because everyone could see it, it spread far faster than before. Yan Jiao was the first to discover this. This time, it wasn't only because of Zhang Yan's message, but also because Yan Jiao had branches all over the heavens and worlds, and the realm gate that could be used at any time. This allowed Yan Jiao to be the first to discover any unusual movements in the world. Gao Qingtu reacted quickly. After hearing about this, he immediately ordered people to deal with these Dharma carvings. Those that could be destroyed were destroyed, and those that could not be destroyed were sealed. However, because there were too many of these Dharma carvings, it was difficult to clean them up one by one. Therefore, even though Yan Jiao acted quickly, there were still many contents on the Dharma carvings that leaked out. Gao Qingtu had no choice but to gather the elders to discuss this matter. An elder suggested, Leader, we can't take care of everything. We can only take care of those important places first. As for the rest of the world, we can only deal with them as we see them. Gao Qingtu deeply agreed and said, that's right. Places like Kunshe continent need to be extra careful. We can't let the creation spirit Tao Dharma carvings invade again and repeat the previous scene. In order to stabilize the situation, Gao Gua had yet to return. However, she was only there to calm the hearts of the people. The Kunshe branch still needed a capable branch master to hold the fort for a long time. At this moment, the elders glanced at Elder Yuan intentionally or unintentionally, but the latter sat there without saying a word. After returning to the main altar, Elder Yuan was stripped of all his power and responsibilities. This was a disguised punishment. In the future, apart from protecting the sect, there was almost nothing else for him to do. Tang Yu thought for a while and said, Teacher, I have a candidate here. Altar Master He, who was originally in Qingyang branch, can take on this position. Immediately, an elder objected, Altar Master He has only reached the level of mortal metamorphosis in the past few years. Perhaps he's more than enough to go to other branch altars, but I'm afraid his cultivation is insufficient to take on the position of Kunshe branch altar's altar master. Tang Yu disagreed and said, there's still senior brother Gao there now. He's enough to take control of the situation. Currently, there are many conflicts between our Yan Jiao and the other sections. If we're not careful, we'll become enemies. Altar Master He is a modest person and is good at mediating relationships between different parties. He's a very suitable candidate. Gao Qingtu thought for a while. Currently, the main objective was to curb the spread of the spirit of creation Tao technique. At this time, they really couldn't deepen the conflict with the other sections. He also had an impression of this He Xianren. Not only did he manage the branch altars under his rule in an orderly manner, but he also rarely got along with the other sects without any discord. This person might not be the most capable candidate, but it was suitable to put him in this position. Thus, he said, "We'll do as Tang Yu says." Once he spoke, everyone no longer objected. They all agreed in unison. Not long after, an edict was sent out from the main altar. Only half a day later, He Xianren received a transfer order. Because the main altar was urging him to take up the post, he didn't dare to be negligent. After packing up a little, he set off for the Kunshe continent. Elder He, who came to deliver the edict, specially reminded, this time, it's to eliminate the conflict with the other sections. In addition, it's to exterminate the spirit of creation Dao technique. As long as these two matters are accomplished, we'll be able to account to the sect master. He Xianren said, "May I ask Elder He, who is the chief protector of the Kunshe continent subaltar, and what kind of person is he?" This time, the edict came without any warning. In the past, due to the rules of the sect, he didn't have any channels to understand the other subalters, so he could be said to know nothing about the situation in the Kunshe continent. And in every subaltar, under the altar master, naturally, the chief protector was the most important. If there was a battle, the altar master rarely appeared, and usually the chief protector would be the one to settle it. Therefore, this person was very important. If this person didn't get along with him, then no matter how great his ability was, it would be difficult for him to display it. Elder He Daoren said, "The chief protector's name is Meng Hu. He wasn't transferred from anywhere else. He was transferred from the mysterious mirror subaltar when the Kunshe continent subaltar was just established. After Chief Protector Duan left, this Chief Protector Meng took over. A few days ago, when the subaltar was in danger, it was mostly because of him that he was promoted to Chief Protector." He Xianren thought about it and asked a few more questions. In fact, Elder He didn't know much about Meng Hu, but he was familiar with Duan Cheng. The latter respected Meng Hu very much, so he roughly explained according to Duan Cheng's meaning. Right now, the Kunshe subaltar couldn't afford to be tossed around. In order not to cause conflict between He Xianren and Meng Hu from the beginning, he added some of his own opinions and slightly raised Meng Hu's status. He didn't think it was too much. Duan Cheng was a very honest person, and the things he said were usually very trustworthy. After listening, He Xianren couldn't help but nod. Through the description, he had a rough impression of Meng Hu in his mind. He was talented, had a strong background, and was outstanding in ability. He was usually a man of few words, didn't strive for credit, and didn't stand out. He relied on his own merits to get to the position of Chief Protector. In short, he was a person who strictly abided by the rules, quietly contributed, and could be relied on at critical moments. He was very gratified, and at the same time, felt a lot more relaxed. If there was such a fellow sect member to support each other, it wouldn't be difficult to stabilize the situation in the Kunshe continent. The two of them quickly crossed the border. After Elder He sent him to the Kunshe continent subaltar, he finished his duty and left. After He Xianren arrived, the first thing he did was to pay a visit to Gao Gua. Then, he summoned his subordinates for a meeting. However, to his regret, Meng Hu had gone out to suppress the outside world. Now that the Taoist techniques and Dharma carvings had appeared one after another, he wouldn't be able to rush back in a short time. Thinking that they still had a long time to spend together in the future, he didn't ask any more questions. After a few days, he more or less understood the specific situation of the subaltar. Generally speaking, the matters of the Kunshe subaltar weren't complicated. The relationship between the subaltar and the sects could only be said to be easing, but it couldn't be said to be very good. However, he believed that as long as there was an external enemy, the spirit of creation, and the sect Yen was always at the front, the sects wouldn't turn hostile. However, there would definitely be a pull behind the scenes. Now, the first thing to deal with was the Taoist techniques of the spirit of creation that were circulating outside. Because those Dharma carvings appeared out of thin air, it was very difficult to eliminate them from the root. Since he couldn't solve it here, he could only think of a solution from the cultivators. He pondered for a long time and summoned all the attendants and Dharma protectors who were still in the subaltar. He issued the first order after becoming the subaltar master, saying, "Pass down my order, close the subaltar's realm gate. Without my personal order and the sect's talisman, no one is allowed to pass through." The realm gate was related to the communication with the main altar, as well as the travel between the sects. In reality, at this point in time, the opening and closing of the realm gate was no longer a matter of the sect Yen alone. This order seemed to be slightly out of line, but He Xianren just now took office. At this time, no one dared to stand out and dissuade him. Therefore, the matter was passed smoothly. At this moment, an attendant suddenly came to report, saying, "Altar Master, Protector Meng has returned." He Xianren revealed a trace of a smile and said cheerfully, "Very good. I happen to have a lot of things to discuss with Protector Meng." He had been looking forward to this meeting. At this moment, he didn't put on the airs of an altar master and waited in the inner hall. Instead, he led everyone out to welcome him.